On July 8, 1879, the USS Jeannette slipped quietly from San Francisco Bay beneath a brass-colored sky. Steam hissed across the water as families waved their last goodbyes. The ship's mission was bold to reach the North Pole and find the fabled open sea said to lie beyond the ice. Her commander, Lieutenant George Washington DeLong, believed that science and discipline could conquer even the Arctic's cold heart. The Jeannette was a fortress of iron and oak, built to withstand what no ship had survived before. But beyond the Bering Strait, the world turned silent. The winds died, the sea hardened, and soon the ship found herself caught frozen in place, locked in an endless night that stretched on for months. What began as a voyage of discovery became a slow descent into stillness. DeLong's journals, written by the dim light of oil lamps, captured the final rhythm of a ship alive yet unmoving, a vessel adrift in a world of ice and echo. They thought they were exploring the edge of the world. Instead, they found its memory a place where silence itself takes form, and the ice remembers every sound that dares to break it. In 1879, the USS Jeannette slipped from San Francisco Bay under a brass-colored sky. Steam hissed over the cold water as families on the pier waved their last goodbyes. The ship's destination was the North Pole, a place no human had ever seen. Her crew of 33 carried hope, science, and a faith that discipline could conquer chaos. Yet beyond the Bering Strait, the world fell silent, and the ice closed like a door that would never open again. The Jeannette was no ordinary vessel. She had once been a British yacht the Pandora purchased and refitted for Arctic exploration by the US Navy. Her wooden hull was reinforced with iron, her coal bunkers doubled for endurance. Every plank was caulked with oakum and tar, every beam braced for the pressure of polar ice. Inside, charts, meteorological instruments, and barometers filled the officer's cabin. On her bow, a brass plaque gleamed in the sunlight, a gift from the American Geographical Society engraved with 3 words, "To the Pole." Her commander, Lieutenant Commander George Washington DeLong, stood at the rail as the harbour shrank behind them. He was 34, deliberate in speech and calm in command, the kind of man who could turn fear into order. His logbook that morning recorded clear weather, calm seas, and a barometer reading of 30.01. Yet between the lines was something else, a quiet awareness that once the Jeannette entered Arctic waters, she would be beyond the world's reach. Among the crew were sailors, engineers, a physician, and a journalist named Jerome Collins, who hoped to document the journey for posterity. Their mission was to find a navigable path to the pole through the Bering Strait, a goal born from the popular open polar sea theory. Scientists believed that, beyond the frozen rim of the north, lay a temperate ocean warmed by Pacific currents. If true, it would rewrite every map of the world. As the ship crossed into colder waters, the crew settled into rhythm. Daily drills, temperature readings, celestial navigation. They sang at night, wrote letters by lamplight, and carved chess pieces from spare wood. Above deck, the first ice appeared floating shards that clinked against the hull like glass bells. The men joked about it, tossing small pieces into mugs of grog, unaware that this gentle rattle was a warning. By early August, they sighted the Diomede Islands, 2 specks dividing Alaska from Siberia. Fog pressed low, and the air grew heavy with the metallic scent of salt and frost. Seabirds followed them for days, then vanished. The Jeannette steamed onward into a grey void where sea and sky merged, and the compass needles began to twitch. Magnetic deviation increased by whole degrees each day. The logbook notes the first irregular readings, which modern analysts now attribute to localized geomagnetic flux in the Chukchi Sea. DeLong remained confident. He trusted in data, not superstition. His men trusted in him. Yet even he must have felt the unease of that horizon, the Arctic's strange stillness, where sound carried for miles yet seemed to come from nowhere. When fog lifted, the world appeared infinite. When it fell, they could not see 20 feet beyond the bow. By September, the temperature dropped sharply. The barometer fell. Sheets of newly formed ice spanned the sea ahead, like frosted glass. DeLong ordered the boilers fired at full pressure to keep a channel open, but each hour the flows thickened. On September 6th, the Jeannette struck her first wall of solid pack ice. The ship shuddered, then stilled. They were surrounded. The expedition that had set out in search of open water was now trapped in a frozen ocean, a wooden island in a world of silence. That night, the crew gathered below deck. The lamps flickered, timber cracked softly as the ice pressed inward. "It will pass," DeLong assured them. "The wind will change." But outside, the Arctic made no sound. The water froze solid, sealing them in place like insects in amber. Above the deck, the last traces of open water vanished beneath a skin of blue-white glass. From the shore of California to the edge of the known world, only 3 months had passed. Yet in that time, the Jeannette had already crossed the threshold between civilization and oblivion. They did not know it yet, but the journey to the pole was over. What remained was the slow, relentless struggle to come back. And in the logbook that night, DeLong wrote a single line: "We are frozen in, and the silence is absolute." Before the ice claimed her, the Jeannette was a symbol of America's ambition to prove that a warm, open sea lay beyond the Arctic Circle. It was called the thermal pole hypothesis. Scientists believed currents from the Pacific might keep the northern waters navigable. DeLong was sent to find that mythical ocean. Instead, he found truth frozen into silence. In the late 19th century, the Arctic was not just a mystery, it was a promise. Maps ended in blank space above Alaska, and every uncharted region represented a frontier waiting to be conquered. European explorers had already claimed glory in Africa and the South Seas. America's gaze turned north. If an ocean existed at the top of the world, it could offer trade routes that bypassed continents, connecting the Pacific and Atlantic in a single continuous passage. To the newspapers, the idea bordered on divine destiny. To the scientists, it was data waiting to be proven. The theory came from a misunderstanding, a blend of meteorology, wishful thinking, and half-read reports from whalers. Sailors returning from northern voyages described patches of open water near the pole, steam rising like breath from a sleeping world. These accounts fueled the notion that warm Pacific currents, driven by the Kuroshio Stream, might push through the Bering Strait and keep the central Arctic ice free. The idea was elegant and wrong, yet in 1878 it was enough to convince America's naval elite that the Arctic could be unlocked by reason and steam. When the Jeannette was commissioned, she represented more than exploration. She was national confidence made tangible: iron bolts, oak beams, and the faith that man's intellect could outlast nature's indifference. Funding came from a mix of government support and private enthusiasm, led by James Gordon Bennett, the wealthy owner of the New York Herald. He wanted headlines, the Navy wanted data, and DeLong wanted history. DeLong's orders were simple in writing and impossible in execution: to sail north through the Bering Strait, reach the pole, and return with proof of an open ocean. He was to make magnetic observations, collect meteorological data, and claim any new lands discovered in the name of the United States. Beneath the official directives lay an unspoken goal: to plant the American flag where none had ever stood. In those days, Arctic exploration was both science and spectacle. Every expedition was a stage play of courage and catastrophe. Crews vanished, ships splintered, and still the world watched with fascination. The Arctic had become a theatre for empire, a frozen mirror where nations measured their strength against the unknown. When the Jeannette left San Francisco, telegraph lines buzzed with updates. Newspapers printed illustrations of the ship sailing into sunlight, never showing what awaited her in darkness. On board, DeLong carried the most advanced instruments of his time: sextants, thermometers calibrated to fractions of degrees, and chronometers synchronized to Greenwich time. They believed precision could protect them, that if they could measure the cold, they could master it. The Jeannette's engineer, George Melville, trusted in his engine's compound steam systems capable of forcing the vessel through flows that would crush lesser ships. He once told a reporter, "There is no such thing as impassable ice, only insufficient pressure, but nature doesn't answer to equations." As the Jeannette advanced northward, DeLong began to notice something troubling. The ice ahead was older, thicker, and less responsive to current. It didn't drift, it anchored. The temperature readings showed no sign of the predicted warmth. Instead of an open polar sea, there was only an endless plain of white, stretching past the horizon. Still, they pressed forward. To turn back was to betray the theory. And in those days, theories carried the weight of faith. "We are on the threshold of discovery," DeLong wrote to Bennett in his final dispatch before communication ceased. All signs point to success, yet the signs were illusions, mirages shaped by light and longing. The Arctic had tricked them, as it had tricked every explorer before. By September, the ship's log recorded constant encounters with pack ice. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and fog began to roll like smoke across the water. The last hope of a navigable ocean froze before their eyes. The Jeannette became a monument to a nation's certainty. The thermal pole hypothesis would die with her, disproven not by instruments, but by the silence of the ice. Future explorers would find no warm currents, no open sea, only the wreck of a ship and the lesson it carried. That ambition alone cannot thaw the Arctic. When the final transmission from DeLong reached the mainland, it was brief and almost serene. Proceeding north, ice forming early, spirits high. After that, the world never heard from the Jeannette again, and so, the dream of the polar passage ended where all human myths begin, in belief strong enough to sail into the unknown, and in silence deep enough to keep its secrets forever. Lieutenant DeLong's promise. Commander George Washington DeLong was a naval officer of calm precision. He had sailed through Arctic waters before, and knew their cruelty. His diaries, later found in the snow, speak of order, faith, and a quiet fear that no training could banish. He believed discipline would save them until discipline met ice. DeLong had always been a man of method. Born in 1844 inches, New York, he entered the Navy at 16 and came of age during the Civil War. By the time the Jeannette expedition was conceived, he was already a seasoned officer, not reckless like some explorers of his age, but deliberate, thoughtful, almost mathematical in the way he planned. His handwriting in the ship's log was neat, his tone measured. Even when describing the Arctic's desolation, his words carried the rhythm of control. "We must not fear the unknown," he once wrote. "It is only the unmeasured that frightens men." That philosophy defined him. Every morning aboard the Jeannette, the crew rose to the sound of the ship's bell at 6. Breakfast at 7, deck inspections at 8, meteorological readings at 9. DeLong insisted on precision not just as discipline, but as defense, a way to keep the mind sharp when the body faced monotony and cold. He was not a man to gamble on luck or legend. He believed in data, in maps, in measurable truth. Yet the Arctic, more than any battlefield or storm, mocked human order. DeLong's previous experience in northern seas had shown him glimpses of that indifference, shifting flows that crushed ships without warning, storms that reversed entire currents overnight. Still, he returned to it willingly. "If man can endure," he told a fellow officer before departure, "then the pole can be reached by patience, not bravado." The men who served under him respected that steadiness. To the sailors, DeLong was more than a commander. He was an anchor in a landscape without landmarks. He rarely raised his voice. Even in danger, he spoke as though reciting procedure. "Calm minds, gentlemen," he'd say when ice shuddered against the hull. "We record before we react." That composure held the crew together through the long months of drifting. But composure cannot warm a ship frozen in darkness. When the Jeannette became trapped, DeLong's belief in discipline began its slow transformation from a source of strength into a fragile illusion. Each morning's roll call shrank as illness crept in. Frostbite claimed fingers, scurvy swelled gums until the men could barely eat. Still, DeLong kept the schedule. Even when his own hands trembled from cold, he made his meteorological entries to the minute, logging barometric pressure and wind direction as though precision itself could keep death at bay. His diary, found later in the snow, reveals this duality the officer's logic entangled with private dread. On one page, he writes of rations and route calculations. On the next, a single haunting sentence: "The ice does not listen to reason." He understood that their survival depended as much on faith as on command, and he clung to both with equal conviction. At night, he read from scripture by lamplight. The flicker of the flame danced on the frost-coated walls of the cabin. Around him, the men listened in silence, not out of piety, but out of need. It was the rhythm of his voice they depended on, more than the words themselves. "He reads like he's steadying the wind," one sailor later wrote. When food began to spoil and the kerosene froze in its cans, DeLong adapted. "If we are to perish, let us leave behind an honest account." To him, death without documentation was chaos, an ending unworthy of reason. The commander's promise was not one of rescue, but of endurance. He had promised his men that order would protect them, that as long as they followed procedure, they could outlast the cold. But the Arctic was no battlefield of willpower. It was an empire of silence. The wind tore their flags to shreds, their compasses faltered, and even time seemed to slip away, swallowed by the endless white. In one of his final entries, written when supplies had dwindled and the ship had vanished beneath the ice, DeLong's handwriting wavers. He notes the date, the temperature -58, and then adds, "We proceed as planned, morale steady." It was a lie written in courage, a final attempt to hold the line between command and surrender. History would remember him not for reaching the pole, but for how he faced its refusal. DeLong's precision could not change the Arctic, but it did something almost as rare: it gave structure to the unknown. His promise to remain steadfast, even as everything around him fractured, became the quiet legacy of the Jeannette. And in the snow where his diary was found, the ink still visible after years of freeze, the final words were not orders, but acceptance. "We did all that men could do." The 8th of June, 1879. The ship cut through the Golden Gate like a blade through mist. Her iron-clad hull was built for pressure and cold. In the cargo hold, thermometers, barometers, scientific cameras, and 2 years of provisions. The papers called her Fortress of the North. None guessed she would never return. The Jeannette's departure was a national event. Crowds lined the wharf in San Francisco, waving hats and handkerchiefs as the ship's black funnel exhaled white steam into the morning air. Bands played patriotic marches from the docks, and newsmen scribbled last-minute notes for their headlines. The Navy's colours fluttered proudly above the deck, and at her bow, a polished figurehead caught the light, the carved face of a woman, eyes fixed northward. She was meant to symbolize victory, though in time she would come to represent something else: humanity's smallness before the unknown. Commander George Washington DeLong stood at the bridge, hat brim low against the glare. He had spent the previous months overseeing every modification to the vessel, reinforcing the keel, insulating the engine room, testing the compasses against the erratic pull of magnetic drift. Every inch of the Jeannette was designed for endurance, for pressure that would crush weaker ships like shells. Her wooden frame, thickened with iron ribs, was meant to flex with the shifting ice rather than fight it. She was not just a ship, she was an experiment in survival. Below deck, the men moved with practiced purpose. 33 souls in total: sailors, engineers, a doctor, a meteorologist, and a correspondent for the New York Herald. They carried with them a world of optimism. Boxes of medical supplies, astronomical instruments, hunting rifles, musical instruments, and even a small library of scientific texts. In their letters home, they wrote of glory, of discovery, of their belief that by autumn they would be the first to see open water at the top of the world. The Jeannette's mission had the full support of James Gordon Bennett Jr., the newspaper magnate whose funding had made the voyage possible. For Bennett, this was more than a scientific expedition. It was a story that would grip a nation hungry for adventure. His paper had followed the exploits of Stanley in Africa. Now, it would chronicle America's conquest of the Arctic. Each transmission from the ship would be wired to the Herald's front page, a real-time tale of courage in the world's coldest frontier. As the ship cleared the bay, fog closed around her like a veil. The music on shore faded. The men stood on deck, watching the coastline disappear. For some, it would be the last glimpse of home they would ever know. One sailor, William Ninderman, later wrote, "It was as though the world folded behind us. Ahead lay only whiteness and wind. They sailed north along the Pacific coast, refueling at Unalaska before crossing into the Bering Sea. The weather remained fair, calm seas, long twilight evenings where the sun dipped but never vanished. Seabirds followed the masts, whales breached near the horizon. To the untrained eye it seemed almost idyllic. But DeLong knew better. Every mile north meant colder currents and unpredictable winds. By late July, they sighted the Diomede Islands, the final gateway before the true Arctic. Beyond those cliffs lay the unbroken expanse of ice. DeLong ordered new bearings taken. The compass quivered slightly, its needle refusing to rest. The ship's log noted the deviation: 4 degrees east, magnetic interference increasing. The men laughed it off, but it was the first warning of how unstable their instruments would become the farther they went. At the edge of the Bering Strait, the sea began to change. The blue of the Pacific darkened into iron grey. The water thickened with floating ice, and the air took on a biting clarity that stung the lungs. The ship's engine groaned under the strain of cutting through slush and shards of frozen salt water. DeLong watched from the bridge, coat buttoned high, his breath turning to mist in the wind. He knew this was where exploration began, where the known world ended and imagination took over. Every evening, he gathered his officers in the mess to review progress. They spoke of charts, weather, and theory. "If the current holds," DeLong said one night, "we'll find open water before autumn." No one contradicted him, though several had already begun to notice that the ice ahead seemed thicker each day. The thermal pole, the warm ocean they sought, was nowhere to be found. On August 28th, the ship crossed 71 degrees north latitude. The temperature dropped below freezing. A fog rolled in so dense that visibility shrank to a few yards. The sea around them turned silent, a mirror of glass that reflected nothing. "It is like sailing through sleep," wrote Collins, the expedition's journalist, and in that eerie calm, as the Jeannette pushed forward into a world of ice and silence, her fate was sealed. The ship that had left San Francisco to prove a theory was already sailing into its own legend. None aboard could yet see it, but the ice was waiting vast, patient, and eternal. When night finally fell, the last sound on deck was the creak of timber and the steady beat of the engine. The stars shone sharp as knives, and the Jeannette pressed northward, a fortress adrift in the dark. By August, the Jeannette reached the icy throat of the Bering Sea. Here the compass began to spin wildly. Electrical storms flickered without thunder. The crew recorded auroras that seemed too low, threads of light touching the mast. Magnetism itself appeared to waver. It was here, between Alaska and Siberia, that the world began to change. The grey waters of the Pacific narrowed into a frozen corridor, choked by ice floes that drifted like fragments of shattered glass. The temperature dropped each hour, and the light itself seemed altered softer, paler, as though filtered through invisible frost. The men stood on deck in their heavy coats, eyes fixed northward, where the horizon had turned the colour of iron. For centuries, this narrow passage, the Bering Strait, had divided myths from maps. Indigenous Chukchi fishermen spoke of spirits in the fog, of voices that called across the water when the air was still. Whalers told of strange mirages, ships that appeared in the sky and vanished before the next wave broke. To De Long, these were only tales, the embellishments of men who had spent too long staring at white horizons. But even he felt something uncanny in that place. "There is a hum in the air," he wrote in his journal. Not sound, but a vibration, as though the world itself is charged. The Jeannette pushed north at 5 knots, steam hissing in steady rhythm. Each evening, the crew gathered on deck to watch the strange lights flicker in the sky. The aurora that August was unlike anything seen at lower latitudes. Curtains of green and violet rippled low over the water, sometimes arching so close that the rigging glowed with a faint electric sheen. The ship's meteorologist, Raymond Newcomb, described it as a silent storm of light, filling the air with unseen currents. The compasses wavered, needles trembling between north and east. Even the ship's chronometers, normally immune to such forces, began to lose synchronization. De Long ordered extra readings taken. If magnetic interference was affecting the instruments, it could throw their navigation fatally off course. The data made no sense. Bearings shifted by whole degrees in a single hour. The auroras pulsed in rhythmic intervals, almost like signals. A natural phenomenon, the officers agreed, but none could explain the pattern. The men whispered about it in their bunks, comparing it to St. Elmo's fire, a sign sailors had long believed to be both omen and warning. Then, one night, the air itself began to glow. The sea ahead shimmered faintly, not from reflected light, but from within. Bioluminescent plankton, some suggested. Others thought it was static discharge. De Long recorded the event with scientific precision, noting the exact coordinates and time. But his description carried something almost poetic. The water shines with a ghostly luster, as if stars have fallen beneath the waves. Each day north of the strait tested both man and machine. The Jeannette's engines struggled against thickening ice. Coal burned faster than expected, forcing the engineers to ration their stores. The sound of the hull grinding through frozen slush became constant, a slow groan that echoed through every beam of the ship. Sleep grew restless. Even in their dreams, the men heard the ice creak and shift. On August 29th, the first real collision came. A floe the size of a city block struck the starboard bow, knocking men off their feet. The hull held, but the shock travelled through the vessel like a heartbeat. De Long's voice remained calm. "Secure all hatches. Keep her steady." The order was obeyed without hesitation. Discipline was their anchor, the one thing still under human control. After the impact, the sea closed around them again, silent and endless. The crew stared into fog so thick it erased the horizon. Somewhere to the west lay Siberia. To the east, the coast of Alaska. But both were invisible. Only the ice remained, shifting and breathing like a living thing. That night, the aurora returned stronger than before. Green waves rippled across the sky, and for a moment, the air above the Jeannette seemed to vibrate. The needles on the compasses spun once more, then froze in place, pointing south, as if the earth itself forgot its direction. One sailor wrote in his log, "In the morning, De Long gathered his officers. We proceed," he said simply. "There's no turning back." His tone was measured, but his eyes lingered on the horizon where the aurora had faded. Beyond the Bering Strait lay the Chukchi Sea, a vast expanse of drifting pack ice and uncharted emptiness. It was the true threshold of the Arctic, the point of no return. The men raised steam, checked bearings, and continued forward into fog that seemed to swallow sound. Behind them, the Pacific fell away warm waters, familiar stars, and every safe harbour they had ever known. Ahead, only cold silence and a sky alive with light. And in the ship's log that night, DeLong wrote a single line that would later be found frozen into the page. The compass dances still. We sail into mystery, the 6th of September, 1879. The floes closed. The ship shuddered, her sails folded like wings trapped in glass. At 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even breath froze mid-air. The men took turns cutting channels that refroze before sunrise. One wrote, "The ice listens. When we sleep, it happened in silence, the kind of silence that seems alive. One moment, the Jeannette was moving through loose slush and fragmented floes. The next, the sea solidified around her, locking the hull in a slow, invisible grip. The water was gone, replaced by something harder than stone, yet always moving, always groaning. The men rushed to the deck as the sound echoed up from below. A deep, hollow cracking that felt more like the earth shifting than ice. DeLong stood at the bridge, his gloved hands gripping the rail. He knew what it meant, their first true entrapment. The Jeannette was no longer a ship. She was a prisoner, held fast by the Arctic itself. Still, he refused to panic. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we are frozen in, and we will make this our fortress." The crew worked for hours, swinging ice saws through the frozen sea, hacking narrow channels in hopes of freeing the vessel. But each cut refroze within minutes, the gaps sealing like wounds. The cold was absolute. At 40 degrees below zero, even the sound of the saws dulled, muffled by air so dense it swallowed echoes. Breath crystallized into tiny clouds of glitter that hung in the air before falling like snow. Inside the hull, everything changed. The ship moaned under pressure, its wooden beams flexing with slow, aching rhythm. Frost crept across the cabin walls, forming delicate webs of ice over the brass instruments. The oil lamps burned low, their flames small and blue. Condensation froze on the inside of portholes, transforming the view outside into a blur of light and frost. DeLong ordered routine to continue. Morning roll call, meteorological readings, clean quarters. He knew that without structure, fear would spread faster than frost. The men obeyed, though their confidence began to waver. They had entered the Arctic believing they could outthink nature, but now nature had written its own law. You will not move until I allow it. Days turned to weeks. The ice shifted and groaned, sometimes cracking like rifle fire, other times rumbling like thunder beneath the floorboards. The sound was constant, not loud, but omnipresent. At night, it vibrated through the bunks, waking men from uneasy sleep. One journal entry simply read, "The ice breathes." As temperatures plummeted, the Jeannette's hull became encased in a frozen wall several feet thick. The decks glittered under starlight, ropes and rigging stiffened into frozen cords. The crew fashioned makeshift shelters on deck, windbreaks of canvas and snow where they stood watch against sudden cracks. There was no true day anymore, only shades of grey between dawn and dusk. Yet, even trapped, they found a strange rhythm of life. The cook, Sam, served hot tea mixed with condensed milk to fight scurvy. The doctor inspected frostbitten hands by lantern light. Collins, the journalist, continued writing dispatches that would never be sent. "We remain confident," he noted. "The ship endures. The men endure." But beneath the veneer of calm, something had shifted. The Arctic was no longer a place they visited. It was a force they had entered. And it had noticed them. The magnetic needles still twitched erratically, and strange lights moved across the horizon, even at noon. "Perhaps," he mused one evening. The pole does not wish to be found. On the 20th night of entrapment, the temperature fell lower than any previous record. The mercury in the thermometer froze solid. The men huddled near the boiler, listening to the wood creak and splinter. At 3 a.m., a sound like a cannon blast shook the ship, a pressure ridge forming beneath the keel. The Jeannette tilted slightly, then settled, the ice closing tighter, as if testing her strength. DeLong wrote in his log, "We hear the world turning under us. I believe the ship may hold." Outside, the Arctic stretched in every direction, endless, white and indifferent. The moon cast a pale halo on the horizon, and frost crystals drifted like falling stars. Somewhere beyond that frozen plain lay their goal, the mythical open sea. But now it was only a story told by men who had never stood where they stood. Inside the cabin, the air was still. A candle flickered once and died. For a long moment, there was nothing but the faint groan of ice pressing against wood. Steady, rhythmic, patient, and in that quiet, the Jeannette ceased to be a ship of discovery. She had become something else entirely, a monument to human will, trapped in a sea that did not care. The next morning, DeLong gathered his men and said, "We will wait for the thaw. We will outlast the ice." But even as he spoke, frost bloomed over the walls like tiny veins, silent proof that the Arctic had no intention of letting them go. 9 months of darkness followed. The sun vanished beyond a line of black cloud. Routine became religion. Measurements at dawn, hymns at 8, silence by midnight. DeLong kept morale by order, but his men's dreams turned strange of green forests and bells that rang under ice. When the last light disappeared in November, the Arctic ceased to have days or nights. Time dissolved into grey hours that bled into one another. The sky was a dome of black glass veined with the shimmer of aurora, and the Jeannette sat buried in a frozen plain that stretched beyond sight. The air was so dry that voices cracked when raised. Even laughter froze quickly, falling in faint crystals that glittered before vanishing. DeLong's first order was simple. Routine must not break. He understood that discipline was not just survival, it was sanity. Each morning, the men woke to the clang of the ship's bell. Frost covered the inside of their bunks like lace. Their breath hung in the air, drifting upward toward the rafters. They dressed in layers of seal skin and wool, scraped ice from the portholes, and began the day's measurements. Temperature, wind, barometer, magnetic deviation recorded faithfully, even when the instruments themselves began to fail. At 8, they gathered in the mess for hymns. The voices were low, more murmured than sung, yet the sound filled the wooden hull with warmth that the stove could not provide. "Faith," DeLong said quietly one morning, "is the one flame that does not freeze." Outside, the world had become a cathedral of silence. The ice expanded and contracted with deep, booming cracks that sounded like distant cannon fire. The ship groaned in reply, a wooden heart beating beneath miles of frozen sea. Men had begun to name the noises. The deep rumble was the organ. The sharp split of pressure ridges they called the bell. It gave the illusion that the world was speaking back to them. Weeks passed without sunlight. The body forgot what daylight felt like. Sleep patterns fractured. Men dreamed with their eyes open. Some claimed to see faint glows below the ice, moving slowly as if alive. "Lanterns underfoot," one sailor whispered. The ship's doctor, Ambler, called it exhaustion mixed with light reflection from the aurora, but others swore the light pulsed in rhythm, as though the ice itself breathed. By midwinter, scurvy had begun to show its face, swollen gums, aching limbs, dull eyes. DeLong rationed lemon extract, the last taste of anything fresh. The cook's hands shook from frostbite as he served meals of salted meat and hardtack. Still, they maintained the ritual of eating together, of speaking as if tomorrow might bring dawn. To occupy their minds, the men held lectures in the evenings. One night, Newcomb spoke about stars they could not see, mapping constellations that existed beyond the clouds. Another night, Collins read aloud from Paradise Lost, his breath turning to mist around each word. There were moments of dark humour, to the kind that comes only to those who have accepted their isolation. The engineer, Melville, carved small figures out of frozen bread. "Crew replacements," he joked. The laughter that followed was brief, brittle, and necessary. DeLong kept a private journal during this period separate from the ship's log. He described how one hummed lullabies in his sleep, how another whispered prayers before taking readings in the bitter cold. They simply moved slower, as though time itself has thickened. By February, the ice pressure increased. The hull strained, timbers creaking in protest. Every man aboard could feel it, the Arctic tightening its grip. Outside, the aurora flared brighter, casting green light over the deck so vivid it painted shadows on the snow. The men stood in silence, staring upward, each wondering if the heavens had come closer or if the earth had fallen away. And then came the sound that would haunt them all, a slow, drawn-out groan beneath the ship, followed by a distant echo. The ice had begun to shift again. It was alive, restless, waiting for the moment to crush what remained of their fragile refuge. In the dark that followed, DeLong wrote one final entry for the season. "We have endured the longest night. I pray that spring is not another illusion, but in the Arctic, dawn is never promised." The horizon remained black, the wind unbroken, and the ship, once a vessel of ambition, now drifted in eternal shadow. The men dreamed of light, of the sun's warmth on their faces, of home, yet when they awoke, there was only the soft hiss of the stove, the whisper of snow against the deck, and the endless, listening silence of a winter without dawn. Their charts showed land northeast of Wrangel Island, a continent that did not exist. Each sighting of open water proved illusion. Even their chronometers froze, ticking time that no longer meant anything. The promise of land had kept morale alive through the long darkness. For months, DeLong's men believed that once the ice broke, they could reach the coastlines marked on their maps, the mysterious Wrangel Land, a supposed continent stretching toward the pole. Every chart of the era included it. Some labelled it the Lost Country of the North. Others showed entire mountain ranges, shaded in ink as if seen by invisible eyes. To the men of the Jeannette, those lines represented salvation. Solid ground, shelter, and perhaps even hunting. But the Arctic is a master of mirage. As the light returned in March, the ice reflected the sun in strange, impossible ways. Horizons rippled like water, and distances collapsed. From the deck, sailors reported dark shapes on the skyline peaks rising beyond the glare. The navigator confirmed bearings, noting the angles and azimuths with precision. "Land due northeast," he wrote, rising steeply from the ice. They cheered, imagining soil under their feet. 2 days later, the peaks vanished. Through his telescope, DeLong saw only clouds shaped like ridges, floating in air thick with frost. "It was there," one of the men insisted. "I swear it." And perhaps, for a moment, it had been. In polar regions, light bends around the curvature of the Earth. Heat gradients, even a few degrees, can create fata morgana optical illusions that transform mist into mountains, air into land. But to men who had not seen anything but white for months, that illusion felt like betrayal. Wrangel Island itself lay to the south, its cliffs and tundra real, though unreachable. Beyond it, their charts showed a continent where none existed. Those maps had been copied and recopied for decades from explorers who had misread fog banks as coastlines. No one had yet corrected them. Even DeLong, meticulous and rational, trusted the printed ink more than his own eyes. "The maps cannot all be wrong," he said quietly. "If there is no land, then where does the ice come from?" The ice answered with silence. Days stretched on. They measured coordinates again and again, each time finding only drift-slow movement westward, carrying them away from the very places they sought. The Jeannette had become a ship adrift in myth. Following ghost continents drawn by dead men, DeLong's frustration grew. His log entries became terse, mechanical. No land, bearings false, compasses unstable. He checked the chronometers, the ship's heartbeat, and found even time had betrayed them. The freezing oil thickened in the gears, slowing each tick until the seconds dragged unevenly. They adjusted, recalibrated, and still the clocks disagreed. It was as if the Arctic itself refused to recognize human time. At night, the false horizons returned. Dark lines wavered above the ice, some shaped like cliffs, others like distant forests. "We see what we want to see," the ship's doctor murmured, watching from the deck. "The mind invents warmth when the world gives none." The men didn't argue. They stared at the glowing edge of the world until the shapes dissolved again into the endless white. The illusion wasn't only visual, it was emotional. The idea of that non-existent land gave them direction, even when they had none. Hope became a form of navigation. "If we can't see it," one sailor said, "then perhaps it's waiting for us." But in the cold, hope and delusion often look the same. By late spring, the ice began to move again, groaning and cracking beneath the ship. The current carried them farther north, not south. The dream of finding land faded. In its place came the slow realization that their charts were lies, elegant fictions drawn by explorers who, like them, wanted to believe the world could not be so empty. DeLong gathered his officers one evening and spread the maps across the chart table. The inked coastlines were faint, blurred by damp and time. He traced the supposed shore with his finger and said nothing for a long while. Then he folded the map neatly and set it aside. "We will draw our own," he said. It was a small act of defiance, but it marked a shift. The expedition no longer sought discovery, it sought endurance. They were not explorers of geography anymore, they were explorers of silence. Outside, the aurora flickered over the frozen horizon, reflecting off nothing. The sea, the sky, the mirage all merged into one boundless illusion. In his journal that night, DeLong wrote a final entry for the day's observations. "The land to the northeast has vanished again. Perhaps it was never there. Perhaps it was only the reflection of ourselves lost upon the ice." By spring, the Jeannette was moving without sail or wind, dragged westward by the pack ice. 1/2 mile per day. The men measured their journey in creeks and cracks. They were adrift in a continent of frozen ocean. The movement was almost imperceptible at first. There was no current they could see, no waves to mark direction. Yet every day, when DeLong and his officers took their noon readings, the coordinates had changed, always to the west, always by roughly the same distance. The ship, trapped fast in ice, was travelling across the top of the world. Not by its own power, but as part of the ice itself, a prisoner carried by its captor. DeLong recorded the phenomenon carefully. Drift continues. Steady. Unavoidable. To a navigator, movement meant life. Yet here, motion was a paradox, a kind of slow burial in silence. The ice was not still. It twisted, shifted, and breathed, carrying the ship with it in an endless grinding tide. Beneath the surface, whole sheets of frozen sea collided like tectonic plates, pushing ridges skyward that rose higher than the ship's deck before collapsing again. Each shift came with sound, the splintering of wood, the moan of steel braces, the sigh of water trapped in pressure. They began to live by those sounds. Every groan of the hull was measured, classified, recorded. The men could tell the difference between the dull thud of distant movement and the sharper pop that meant danger nearby. "The ice speaks to us," one sailor wrote. "We learn its moods like we once learned the seas." The drift carried them deeper into uncharted regions of the Arctic basin, farther north than any American ship had ever gone. DeLong's sense of scientific duty remained unbroken. He continued to collect meteorological data, magnetic readings, and temperature profiles, knowing that even if they never escaped, the records might outlive them. "If our ship perishes," he wrote, "let our notebooks float south." Inside the ship, life had slowed to match the rhythm of the ice. The men repaired boots, sharpened saws, mended clothing, and told stories in low voices. They marked the walls with pencil lines showing their westward progress. By April, they had drifted nearly 50 miles. It was a strange kind of voyage direction without destination. The Arctic sun returned briefly in a pale glow that hovered near the horizon, never fully rising. It revealed a landscape that seemed infinite. Ice ridges stretching to the edge of vision, tinted pink by the weak sunlight. The stillness was so profound that even the faint crack of distant ice carried for miles. The ship sat like a splinter in a field of glass, but the beauty carried menace. The drift was not gentle, it was relentless. The ice around the hull rose and fell like a sleeping giant's breath. Some nights, pressure ridges formed so close that they sounded like cannon fire. On others, the ice opened in sudden fractures, exposing black water that hissed and steamed in the cold. The men learned to wake at the slightest sound. One sailor described it in his diary. "You begin to sleep in rhythm with the creaks, like the ticking of a clock that could stop at any time." DeLong himself seemed almost hypnotized by the drift. He plotted every shift of position, every change in current. It was then he began to suspect a great circulating system beneath the ice, a hidden oceanic river that carried everything westward. Years later, scientists would confirm this as the transpolar drift, but in 1880, DeLong could only guess at its scale. By May, food stores had begun to freeze solid, and fuel reserves dwindled. The cook broke ice from barrels to melt for water, while the doctor rationed lemon extract against scurvy. Yet discipline endured. Each morning began with measurements, each evening with quiet readings from scripture or poetry. Order was their only warmth. Still, there were moments when the enormity of their isolation sank in. One night, during a rare clearing, the aurora blazed overhead in colours no one had words for: pale blue at the edges, burning white at the centre. The ice field glowed as if lit from within, and for a few minutes the men stood on deck in silence, watching the heavens move faster than they could. It felt like time itself had accelerated while they remained still. In his log that night, DeLong wrote, "The ship drifts, the ice breathes, and we are carried somewhere we cannot see. I no longer command our course. I observe." The Jeannette continued westward, a wooden speck on a continent of moving ice, bound for a place no chart had ever marked. And as the days blurred together, the men began to understand that the Arctic had its own form of navigation. Not by stars or compass, but by surrender. They were explorers no longer chasing discovery. They were passengers of the ice, silent witnesses to a world that moved without them. They heard it first at night, a deep throbbing under the ship. Some said it was pressure ridges forming, others thought it was the earth itself groaning. One sailor wrote, "It sounds like a heartbeat below us." The noise came from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, it was faint, a distant pulse that echoed through the floorboards. Then it grew, resonating through the hull until every timber vibrated. The men froze where they stood, listening. The Jeannette seemed alive, as though something vast and unseen was stirring beneath the ice. DeLong ordered the stoves extinguished so they could listen clearly. The flames died, and silence deepened. Then, from the depths below, came another sound, lower, heavier, rolling through the ship like distant thunder. It lasted nearly a full minute. "Pressure ridge forming," said the engineer. though even he sounded unsure. The Arctic was shifting again, moving in ways no man could predict. The sound was unlike the groans of the ice they had grown used to. It carried rhythm slow, deliberate, and unsettlingly steady. A pulse that seemed to come from deep within the frozen sea. The doctor compared it to the human heartbeat, but slower, larger. As if the earth itself exhales, he said. The men began to call it the voice. Each night it returned. Sometimes it throbbed in the distance, faint as a drum beneath snow. Other times it rolled directly under the keel, shaking spoons in their cups and making the lamps sway. DeLong noted the phenomenon in his log, measuring its timing against the known cycles of the ice. Yet the pattern made no sense. It came at irregular intervals, sometimes separated by hours, sometimes only minutes apart. For the men, sleep became uneasy. They began waking at the sound, whispering to each other in the dark. Some swore the vibrations were accompanied by flashes of light far below faint glows that shimmered through cracks in the ice. When the doctor investigated, he found nothing but solid frost. Refraction, he concluded. The ice traps and bends the moonlight. But there was no moon that night. The Arctic has its own acoustics, a strange ability to carry sound across unimaginable distances. Later generations would explain it as resonance, the ice sheet acting like a drum, amplifying the smallest cracks and distant movements of pressure ridges. But to the men of the Jeannette, it felt supernatural. You could feel it through your bones, one diary read. It spoke to you whether you wanted to hear it or not. One evening, Melville, the ship's engineer, lowered an iron rod through a crack in the ice, pressing his ear to the metal. When he pulled it back, his face was pale. "It's not just ice moving," he said softly. "It's something deeper. The water itself is talking." DeLong refused to entertain superstition, but even he could not fully explain it. He made sketches of pressure patterns on the hull, measuring the times between vibrations. When compared against his own tidal charts, the results were off by hours. The Arctic tides had no rhythm that matched the sounds they heard. By February, the phenomenon had become part of their world. The men marked its occurrence on a chalkboard, as though tracking a storm. Some nights the voice was silent, and the quiet felt heavier, more oppressive than the noise itself. Others, the throbbing would return so powerfully that frost rained from the rafters. It began to affect their imaginations. A few of the crew spoke of dreams of vast caverns under the ice, where water moved like breath through lungs. One man claimed he had seen shadows below the hull, as if something was swimming in circles, waiting. He was dismissed as delirious, though more than one sailor admitted to hearing splashes beneath the solid ice. DeLong wrote in his private diary, "The sounds persist. They are not mechanical nor atmospheric. They may belong to the ice itself, alive, restless, ancient. In the months to come, those sounds would intensify." The ice field that carried them westward was tightening. Tremors rolled through the frozen sea like distant earthquakes. The Jeannette creaked and moaned under the mounting pressure, and every noise, every whisper from below felt like a warning. On one particularly still night, the pulsing stopped. The air hung heavy, frozen in complete silence. Then, suddenly, a single sharp crack split the quiet, a sound like the snapping of the world's spine. The men rushed to the deck. The ice ahead had opened, a black wound stretching across the white horizon. The Arctic had spoken again. But this time, it was not a voice. It was a fracture, a sign that something deep beneath them was shifting, preparing for the inevitable. In his log that night, DeLong wrote, "The voices have ceased. The silence feels wrong. I fear the ice is gathering its strength." The next morning, the temperature dropped further. The hull creaked with a low, ominous hum. The men said nothing, but each knew the truth. The Arctic was no longer merely holding them, it was tightening its grasp. The 12th of June, 1881. The ice split like gunfire. Timbers buckled. Water roared through the hold. DeLong ordered abandoned ship. Minutes later, the Jeannette was gone, swallowed whole by the white sea. The end came not with warning, but with sound, a sudden, deafening crack that tore through the frozen stillness. For months the pressure had built unseen beneath the ice, twisting, tightening, crushing the ship in its grip. That morning, as the men ate their meagre breakfast of hardtack and tea, the hull shuddered. A low groan deepened into a roar. Plates crashed to the floor. The Jeannette's frame splintered with the force of 1,000 tons of moving ice. "On deck!" DeLong shouted. The men surged upward, boots slipping on frost-slick stairs. Outside, the world itself seemed to be breaking apart. The ice around the ship rose in jagged walls, squeezing the vessel like a vice. The sound was relentless, snapping beams, shrieking metal, the thunder of wood collapsing under pressure. Melville, the engineer, shouted that the hull had breached. A dark rush of freezing water poured through the lower deck, rising fast. Within minutes, the ship that had endured 2 Arctic winters began to die. DeLong's orders came clear and calm. Save the journals, the logs, the charts, take nothing else. The men obeyed without hesitation. They grabbed the expedition's notebooks, the magnetic readings, the chronometers, the evidence of everything they had endured. Barrels of provisions were hauled onto the ice. Tents, sledges and rifles followed. The wind howled around them, carrying flakes of ice that cut the skin like glass. Then came the final collapse. The Jeannette lurched violently to one side, her masts tilted against the grey sky, sails torn and frozen stiff. With a long groaning sigh, the Arctic claimed her. The ship that had once been a fortress was reduced to fragments, beams, ropes, and shattered planks vanishing into the churn of broken ice. The sea swallowed the sound, leaving only silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The men stood on the floe, surrounded by the wreckage of their home, staring at the hole where the ship had been. The horizon stretched unbroken in every direction, no land, no light, only wind. "She's gone," whispered one sailor. DeLong simply nodded. "Then we move," he said. "The expedition continues." They salvaged what they could. Maps, rifles, food enough for a few months. DeLong divided them into 3 sledging teams, their destination uncertain. The nearest known land lay hundreds of miles to the south. To reach it, they would have to drag their boats across the ice, following the current that had once carried them. That night, the Arctic was eerily still. The temperature fell below -40, and the sky burned with ribbons of green aurora. The men huddled in their tents, listening to the ice settle where the ship had sunk. Someone murmured, "She's still there, below us." No one answered. DeLong wrote his final entry aboard the Jeannette on a scrap of damp paper. "The ship is gone. We are 33 souls adrift upon the ice. We carry the flag, and we carry each other. When dawn came, if it could be called dawn, the wreck was already sealed beneath new ice." The Jeannette had vanished without trace, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the memory of wood. The expedition was no longer a voyage. It was survival. 33 men, 3 whaleboats, 700 pounds of supplies. Ahead lay 1,000 miles of broken ice. They pulled south into the wind, with hope as their only sail. The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. DeLong divided the survivors into 3 small teams, each commanded by an officer, each towing a single boat across the floes. The boats were their lifelines, wooden shells that might one day carry them across open water if they ever reached it. Every man knew that to lose a boat was to lose any chance of seeing home again. They moved south through a labyrinth of shattered ice. The floes shifted constantly, groaning underfoot, splitting without warning. The men dragged their boats over ridges, lowered them into gaps, then hauled them up the other side with ropes biting into their shoulders. Each step was labour. Each breath burned the lungs. The Arctic offered no path, only resistance. The ice beneath them was alive. It cracked, hissed, and sighed as if it resented their intrusion. Sometimes the surface opened without warning, revealing black water below so still and cold it looked like polished glass. They called these gaps leads, but they were traps. Crossing them meant inching across makeshift bridges of ice, their boats sliding behind like coffins. At night, they camped on the largest floes they could find, spreading canvas for shelter. The wind never stopped. It whistled through every seam and rattled the tin kettles like a cruel reminder. Meals were little more than melted snow and salted meat. Even sleep gave no relief. The ice shifted beneath them as they lay down, tilting their tents, sometimes snapping ropes clean in the night. DeLong's logbook from those days reads like an act of endurance. He noted bearings, temperatures, and drift speeds, even as his hands cracked and bled from cold. Progress negligible, he wrote, but morale remained steady. Men sing while working, I encourage it. Songs became survival rhythm in chaos, sound against silence. By July, the ice had grown treacherous. Warm winds began to melt the surface, creating pools of slush waist-deep in places. The men waded through it for hours, their clothes freezing stiff once they emerged. Frostbite spread quickly. One sailor, Erickson, collapsed mid-march. His legs refused to move. DeLong ordered a halt, gave him hot tea, and waited until he could stand again. No one was left behind. Not yet. The further they went, the less they trusted the compass. Magnetic interference warped every reading. The sun was their only guide, a pale disk behind veils of mist. Still, they pressed south, following the faint idea of land, any land. Each night before sleep, DeLong recited a prayer aloud, his voice quiet but steady. For strength tomorrow, for mercy tonight. The men listened in silence. No one believed salvation would come quickly, but belief itself became a weapon against despair. On the 30th night, as they camped on a floe the size of a city square, the sound of cracking ice jolted them awake. A fissure had opened beneath the center of the camp, splitting their supplies in two. One of the boats slid toward the edge, teetering above the black water. In the chaos, 3 men leapt forward, catching it with ropes before it vanished. When the floe stabilized, DeLong looked at his men and said only, "That's one prayer answered." They slept no more that night. The ice had reminded them of its mercy and its limits. The next morning, the journey continued, 33 men, 3 boats, and a prayer that had to last across 1,000 miles of white silence. They hauled sledges over ridges taller than houses. Boot spikes snapped. Frostbite crept like ink. Distances shrank from miles to yards. DeLong's entries grew shorter, words replaced by numbers and weather. Each day was a repetition of exhaustion. The horizon never changed, white upon white, broken only by the jagged teeth of pressure ridges that rose from the frozen sea. The men advanced by inches, pulling their sledges like beasts of burden. The boats they dragged behind them grew heavier with every mile, the wood thick with frost and ice. When the wind rose, it drove fine crystals into their eyes, cutting vision to slivers. Still, they moved forward. To stop was to freeze. The Arctic was dismantling them piece by piece. Gloves stiffened into armour, and fingers lost their feeling. When they rested, steam from their breath condensed on their beards, freezing into icicles that clinked when they spoke. The men stopped talking after a while. Speech wasted breath, and breath carried warmth away. DeLong led quietly, his pace steady, his eyes scanning the ice for danger. He knew that discipline was the only thread holding them together. At the end of each march, he ordered the same ritual. Pitch tents, melt snow for water, record data. Even now, even when science seemed meaningless, he insisted on order. The logbooks were filled with numbers, coordinates, barometer readings, the direction of wind. Facts were his defense against despair. The doctor, Ambler, tended to the wounded and frostbitten. He worked without complaint, using strips of wool and animal fat to keep flesh from blackening. But there were limits. When one man's fingers turned grey and brittle, Ambler said nothing. He simply looked at DeLong and shook his head. The loss was recorded in silence. Food became a constant arithmetic. They rationed down to ounces, cutting biscuits into equal pieces. When the fuel ran low, they burned scraps of canvas to heat a single pot of tea. "Every cup is worth a day," DeLong wrote. At night, when the wind howled against the tents, the sound mimicked the groaning of the ship they had lost. Some men woke believing they were back aboard the Jeannette. Others whispered in their sleep, calling for home. The line between dream and waking blurred. On the 12th day of marching, they reached a field of shattered ice, an expanse of tilted slabs piled 30 feet high. It looked like a frozen storm caught mid-motion. They spent hours carving a path through it, hacking with axes, hauling the boats over one piece at a time. The ice moved as they climbed, groaning under their weight. One misstep meant falling into the black void beneath. When they finally reached flat ground again, they collapsed in silence. The horizon burned faintly with twilight, not true sunset. Just the suggestion of it. They stared at the light without speaking, as if remembering that the world beyond this place still had colour. That night, DeLong's journal entry was only a few lines long. Distance gained, 1 mile. Wind north. Morale steady. Feet failing. He closed the book, wrapped it in oilskin, and tucked it beside him before sleep. The sound of the wind filled the silence again, endless, ancient, indifferent. By morning, the drift had undone half their progress. The ice had carried them backward overnight. They began again, and in that repetition, the endless motion of men against a moving world, the Arctic taught them its cruelest lesson. That survival is not forward movement, but refusal to stop. Every day they chased a line that moved away as they walked. Mirages of open water rose and vanished. The crew called it ice mirage fever. Modern science calls it atmospheric lensing. Back then, it felt like madness. The Arctic plays tricks on light, bending it, stretching it, painting false promises across the sky. What looked like distant blue seas were only reflections of the clouds, inverted by layers of air at different temperatures. The men didn't know that. To them, it was hope appearing and disappearing on the edge of vision. Each shimmer looked like salvation, and each vanishing left them a little more hollow. DeLong kept the men moving, though he understood what was happening. "The light deceives," he warned. "Trust your compass, not your eyes." But the compasses spun erratically, drawn off course by the magnetic pull of the pole. The only constant was movement forward, always forward, toward a horizon that retreated like a living thing. They marched in near silence, boots crunching over frost, sledges scraping the ice. The air itself shimmered, turning the landscape into layers of motionless waves. Sometimes the sky reflected downward, so that mountains seemed to hang upside down above them. Other times, the sun stretched into a vertical column, a false dawn that refused to fade. The men began to whisper that the world itself was folding. Collins, the ship's journalist, wrote of the illusion in his diary. "We walk toward water that never comes closer. The sea hides behind itself." His words read like poetry, but they came from exhaustion. Men who once laughed now walked with glassy eyes, hypnotized by light. When he fell face first into solid ice, they dragged him back in silence. No one spoke for the rest of the day. By the third week of marching, mirages became a daily torment. Some appeared as green hills, others as black cliffs that dissolved when approached. DeLong understood the physics heat layers between cold strata of air, but even knowledge couldn't defend against despair. To see and not believe is harder than blindness, he told Ambler one night. As rations dwindled, the mirages grew sharper, crueler. Hunger blurred the line between hallucination and reflection. The men began to describe things the eye could not measure. Forests trembling on the horizon, ships gliding silently across the sky. The Arctic was giving them visions or taking something from their minds to feed its illusions. At times, even DeLong felt it. One evening, as he wrote by the flicker of a lamp, he looked out across the ice and saw the faint shape of the Jeannette itself, whole and upright, her masts glinting in the dying light. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, she was gone. He didn't mention it in the log. Some sights were not meant for record. That night, the temperature dropped again. The horizon glowed faintly blue, not from sunlight, but from the bending of moonlight across layers of cold air. It looked like the edge of the world, frozen mid-breath. The men sat around their dwindling fire, watching that ghostly glow, no longer asking what was real. DeLong's final note for the day was brief. Mirages persistent, crew silent, the horizon still runs. And with that, he closed his journal. Outside, the false ocean shimmered one last time, then vanished into the endless white, a final trick of light for men too tired to chase it. Engineer Alexei Kuhner fell on July 28. They buried him beneath a cairn of frozen blue ice. DeLong wrote, "He faces north, still keeping watch." It was the first grave on a sea that never melted. The death was not sudden, but inevitable. Kuhner had been weakening for weeks, frostbitten feet, sunken eyes, hands too numb to grip the sledge ropes. He never complained. Each morning, he rose with the others, adjusted his worn gloves, and said the same words. "Another mile, sir." But on that grey morning, his body could no longer obey his will. He stumbled once, caught himself, then collapsed into the snow without sound. Ambler, the doctor, knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse that wasn't there. "It's over," he said simply. The wind blew across the ice, carrying away the steam from their breath. No one moved for a long moment. In a place where every step demanded life, death arrived quietly, not with violence, but exhaustion. They carried his body on the sled until DeLong ordered a halt. The ice there was solid, shimmering with veins of deep blue. "We bury him here," he said. The men began to dig through frost that fought them for every inch. Axes chipped, spades cracked. But they carved a shallow hollow in the ice and laid Kuhner inside. Wrapped in canvas. There were no hymns, no bugle, no flag. Just a circle of men, frost clinging to their beards, eyes hollow from hunger and cold. DeLong removed his cap. "He was faithful," he said softly. "He served until he could not. We leave him to the care of the North." Then they piled ice blocks over the body, building a cairn tall enough to resist the wind. At its peak, DeLong placed a small wooden cross carved from a broken oar. For the first time, the crew spoke of home aloud. One muttered a prayer in German. Another whispered his wife's name. The Arctic, vast and indifferent, swallowed every word. The horizon shimmered faintly with light, the kind that never warmed. When they marched again, the silence felt heavier. No one spoke for hours. The dogs whined softly, their breath steaming in the cold air. Kuhner's absence was more than a missing man. It was a fracture in the fragile illusion of endurance. Death, once theoretical, had become part of their company. That night, DeLong wrote in his journal by the dim glow of a tallow lamp, "This is the first grave on the frozen sea. We have done all that men can do for him." The others sleep now. I do not. I feel the ice beneath us move slowly, endlessly. The movement was real. The flow was drifting again, carrying them westward toward uncertainty. The cairn would drift too, a grave adrift on a shifting sea, its occupant travelling farther north than any living man would ever go. The men dreamed uneasily. Some said they heard knocking beneath the ice, like tools striking wood. DeLong dismissed it as exhaustion, but he made no note of it in the morning report. Some truths were better left unrecorded. Before they broke camp, he turned once more toward the cairn. The cross was barely visible against the horizon, already frosting over. "Keep watch," he murmured, repeating his own words from the burial. Then he turned south, the sound of his boots fading into the frozen wind. Behind them, the Arctic reclaimed its silence. The first grave sank a little deeper into the ice, the blue light closing over it like a curtain. After 91 days adrift, dark land appeared on the horizon. Siberia. Relief broke into tears, but between them and the shore lay rivers of moving ice. Salvation was so close they could hear it crack. For weeks, the men had seen nothing but endless white horizon and sky merging into one frozen void. Then, one grey morning in late September, the world changed. Ahead, through mist and fog, they saw it a faint shadow where sky met earth. Land. The first solid ground since the Jeannette had vanished beneath the ice 3 months earlier. Men who hadn't spoken in days cried openly. Some fell to their knees. DeLong, pale and gaunt, said quietly, "That's Siberia." But the sight that gave them hope also delivered despair. Between them and the coast lay a labyrinth of shifting ice channels and freezing rivers, 1,000 fractures of water that moved like veins through the flows. To reach shore meant crossing a world that was coming apart beneath them. The ice cracked, shifted, and closed again, swallowing anything too slow to move. They began at dawn. The boats were dragged across hummocked ice, then lowered into dark leads of open water, rowed for minutes, and lifted again when the path froze ahead. Every motion was agony. Frost-bitten hands bled at the touch of wet rope. Feet slipped on black slush that hid fractures just wide enough to swallow a man. Still, they pressed on, pulled forward by the sight of that dark, unmoving line of land. DeLong set the pace, his compass strapped to his wrist, his breath shallow and ragged. "Keep your eyes on the coast," he told them. "It's closer than it looks." But distances in the Arctic are deceitful. The mirage of the mainland rose and fell with the light, always a few miles farther than they believed. By the second day, exhaustion blurred thought. The men fell often, their faces hollow, their words slurred. Ambler, the doctor, moved among them quietly, forcing sips of melted snow down their throats. "If you sleep," he said, "you freeze." Sleep became the enemy, a soft, warm descent that promised rest but ended in stillness. Late on the third day, the wind shifted. The ice began to move faster, driven by currents that pulled the floes apart. DeLong saw open water widening between them and shouted, "Run!" They hauled the boats across splintering ridges, slipping, falling, gasping through clouds of frozen spray. At one point, the lead boat nearly went under its keel, catching in a gap. The men threw themselves forward, dragging it clear just as the ice sealed shut behind them with a thunderous crack. When they finally reached a stable flow, the land loomed near so close they could hear the surf breaking against the frozen shore. But they were too weak to cheer. They stared in silence, each man caught between awe and disbelief. DeLong recorded the moment in his journal with careful precision, latitude 71 degrees north. The Lena Delta in sight, the land of the living. That night, they camped within sight of Siberia's dark cliffs, the wind carrying the faint smell of earth for the first time in months. It was a cruel mercy close enough to taste, but not yet theirs. The men slept fitfully, listening to the ice groan beneath them. Somewhere in the dark, a crack echoed like distant thunder, the Arctic's final warning. DeLong closed his notebook and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, we walk to land or die trying." A storm ripped the party apart. One boat was never seen again. DeLong's group reached shore, starved, frostbitten, but alive. They did not know help was still hundreds of miles away. The storm came without warning. A wall of wind rose from the east, tearing across the Arctic Sea like a living thing. The sky turned the color of slate, and within minutes, the horizon vanished. Waves struck the boats like hammer blows, each crest lifting them high before slamming them down into valleys of black water. Snow and seawater mingled in the air until even breathing felt like drowning. DeLong shouted orders through the gale, his voice swallowed by the wind. The boats, lashed together by rope, began to drift apart. "Hold the line!" someone cried, but the line snapped a sound like a rifle shot in the storm. The second boat vanished into the fog. A third was carried south by a rogue wave. For a brief, flickering moment, DeLong saw its lantern through the spray, a small orange star tumbling across the horizon. And then it was gone. When dawn returned, it found silence. The sea was flat again, littered with ice and debris. Only DeLong's boat remained. 13 men, shivering, soaked, and barely conscious. Their supplies had been scattered or lost. What food remained was soggy and frozen solid. The other boats, Melville's and Chip's, were nowhere to be seen. DeLong ordered a bearing south toward the nearest coast, the delta of the Lena River, a maze of frozen channels stretching deep into Siberia. They rowed through a world half ice, half water, the line between the two invisible. The men's hands bled from the oars. Frost crept up their sleeves until fabric and flesh fused. The wind burned their faces raw, yet the thought of land, real, solid ground, kept them alive. "We will reach it," DeLong said, though his voice was barely a whisper. By evening, the sea ice thickened again. They abandoned the oars and used poles to push through narrow leads of slush and debris. The sound of cracking ice was constant, a reminder that the ocean beneath them was still moving. When they finally saw land, it rose like a shadow, a dark smudge through the grey fog. Several men wept openly. Siberia. The word itself sounded like salvation, but the shore was not kind. The ice between them and land was fractured into rivers of shifting plates. Each step forward was a gamble. The flows moved, collided, split. DeLong led the way, testing each path with his staff. Twice the ice gave way beneath his feet, plunging him waist-deep into the freezing sea. Both times, his men pulled him out by the arms, wordless, driven only by instinct. When they finally reached solid ground, they collapsed where they stood. Some kissed the frozen earth, others simply lay still, too weak to move. The relief was overwhelming and cruelly brief. Before them stretched an empty wasteland of tundra and marsh. No shelter, no firewood, no sign of life. Only the sound of the wind sweeping over the plains. DeLong wrote a single line in his notebook that night. "We have found land, but not safety." The men huddled together under their overturned boat, the storm still echoing faintly in their ears. Out at sea, the others were gone, carried into the Arctic silence, their fates already written beneath the waves. October 9. The Lena River solidified in a single night. Their path vanished beneath a mirror of ice. The thermometer broke at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They walked on until their shadows froze into the snow. It was supposed to be the river that saved them, a road of flowing water leading south through the Siberian delta toward villages, warmth, and rescue. For days, they had followed its winding channels, dragging their boats over sandbars and pushing through slush so cold it stung through their boots. But in the Arctic, nothing remains liquid for long. The transformation came without warning. One evening, they camped beside a slow-moving current. By morning, the river was solid from shore to shore, frozen smooth as glass. The men stood in disbelief. Even in this place, ice did not form so fast, not in hours, not overnight. Yet the liner had turned to stone. The air itself felt heavier, as though time had thickened. The silence was absolute. Even their breath seemed to fall instead of drift. DeLong tapped the surface with his boot. It rang like steel. "We move," he said. "While it holds." They began marching across the frozen river, pulling the sledges behind them. Each step echoed. The ice was slick and clear, revealing the black depth below water and darkness trapped beneath their feet. Frost clung to their faces, forming pale masks that cracked when they spoke. The world around them had narrowed to two colours, white above, black below. The cold that day was beyond measure. The thermometer they had carried since the Jeannette shattered before noon, the mercury frozen into a grey lump inside the glass. Ambler estimated the temperature at 60 degrees below zero, a cold so complete that metal burned the skin and fabric stiffened into wood. The men's eyelashes froze together each time they blinked. One sailor tried to adjust his hat and tore the skin from his fingers when it stuck to the cloth. By midday, the faint warmth of motion began to fade. They moved slower, their footsteps sluggish, their shadows long and blue against the white glare. The sun never rose fully anymore, just a dim glow that circled the horizon, giving the illusion of eternal dusk. In that twilight, their shadows thickened, then stilled, etched into the frost like ghostly silhouettes. One man whispered, "Even the sun has given up on us." DeLong forced them forward. He spoke less now, saving his voice for commands. His beard was a mass of ice, his lips split and bleeding. When a man fell, they stopped just long enough to lift him. "Keep moving," DeLong said. "We stop when we reach the next rise." But there was no rise, only the endless flat river stretching toward an invisible south. By evening, the wind returned. It came howling down the frozen channels, raising glittering clouds of ice dust that stung their eyes and filled their lungs. The sound was hollow, like breath moving through a flute. They pulled their scarves higher, faces hidden, shapes fading into the pale storm. That night, they made camp on the river itself, setting the tents on ice that moaned beneath their weight. The firewood was gone, so they burned fragments of their sledges for heat. The flames flickered blue, barely visible in the wind. Before sleep, DeLong wrote one final note for the day. "The river is dead. We walk on its body, men silent, spirits low, but still we go." Outside the tent, the ice shifted once, groaning like something alive. Then it froze still again, sealing them into another night that felt like forever. The camp was neat, rifles stacked, pots clean, no sign of panic. Searchers found them months later. Faces turned east toward the rising sun that never came. The discovery came in March of 1882. Long after the Arctic winter had buried their footprints beneath wind and ice. A small team of Yakut hunters moving along the Lena Delta saw a faint line of canvas caught in the snow, a tent half collapsed, frozen in place. When they approached, they realized it was not empty. Inside lay the remains of Commander George Washington, DeLong and his men, arranged as if waiting for orders. The tent was astonishingly orderly. DeLong's journal lay beside him, wrapped in oilskin. The last entry read simply, "October 30. All hands weak. One death today. God grant us mercy." His handwriting trembled but remained precise to the end, even as his body failed. His discipline never did. Around him were the things of everyday routine. Tin cups cleaned, boots aligned, rifles resting in their rack. the final act of a man who refused to surrender to chaos. They had camped near a bend in the frozen river, a place where the current once flowed before the world turned to ice. The storm that trapped them had lasted 3 days, sealing off every direction. When the wind stopped, the men were too weak to move. DeLong ordered them to set camp anyway, tents pitched, logs stacked, food rationed, as if the act itself might conjure salvation. But the food was gone, the fuel was gone, and the cold was absolute. Ambler, the doctor, had been the last to write in his own notes, "Commander fading, men delirious, cannot make fire." Then his pen froze mid-sentence. The searchers could tell they had not died in panic. There were no signs of struggle, no desperate claw marks in the ice. It was as if they had simply grown still. Some lay in their sleeping bags. Others sat upright, backs against the tent wall, eyes closed. One man's hands were folded across his chest. Another clutched a pencil. All faced east toward the dawn that never broke in that endless polar night. When the rescue team from Melville's surviving boat finally arrived weeks later, they stood in silence. Melville himself knelt by DeLong's side, touching the frozen sleeve of his commander's coat. "He died as he lived," he said softly, in order. They gathered what papers and journals they could find, the records of a journey that had begun in hope and ended in stillness. The temperature that day was 40 below zero. The wind carved lines across the snow, reshaping the small mound of their camp into a seamless drift. Before leaving, Melville built a cross from broken sledwood and anchored it with stones. "For those who sought the pole," he whispered, "and found eternity instead." As they turned away, the wind began again, faint but rising, the Arctic reclaiming its silence. Within hours, the tent was gone, beneath fresh snow. Only the cross remained, barely visible in the white distance, marking a place where human will met the edge of the world. Years later, explorers who followed DeLong's path would find fragments, a rusted spoon, a frozen boot, a page of his handwriting sealed in ice. The ink still legible, the words unwavering. "We have done our duty. Tell the world we were not afraid." And so the story of the Jeannette ended not with rescue, but with quiet defiance, a final order kept to the last breath. The Arctic held them, as it holds all who dare its silence in beauty, in terror, and in peace. When the journal was found, the ink had crystallized into black frost. The last line read, "Mr. Collins died at sunrise. God forgive us all." Then silence. The discovery of DeLong's journal was more than an artifact. It was the voice of men who had vanished into history. When Melville's rescue party uncovered the frozen camp, they found the small oilskin-wrapped notebook beneath a pile of folded clothes, preserved as though waiting to be read. The paper had turned brittle, the ink frozen mid-sentence, yet the words were clear, written in a hand that refused to tremble, even in the final moments of life. The journal began as a captain's record, precise, factual, disciplined. Entries tracked weather, bearings, and the condition of his crew. But as the months dragged into despair, the tone shifted. The sentences shortened. The language became stripped of everything but truth, weakness growing, wind constant, men silent. There were no embellishments, no pleas for rescue, only an unflinching account of endurance measured in inches and hours. Those final pages charted the slow unravelling of life in the camp. DeLong's words were not written for glory, but for record, a way to ensure that the story of the Jeannette would not disappear into the ice. "Our position fixed," one entry reads. "Latitude 71 degrees 57 N. The river frozen, spirits failing. We shall keep together." Each line is a monument, simple, steady, human. The ink itself had transformed. Under the microscope years later, it was found to have frozen in tiny crystalline ridges, each letter rising like a carved relief against the paper. The Arctic had preserved it not merely as writing, but as texture, like the veins of the ice that entombed them. The words, quite literally, had become part of the landscape. Reading it, Melville wrote that he felt as though DeLong were speaking through glass. The calm of those final lines was haunting. Mr. Collins died at sunrise. God forgive us all. There was no record after that. The pencil stopped halfway down the page, the line ending in a faint blur, perhaps the moment his hand stiffened, or his breath turned to frost before the ink could dry. The journal became the final testimony of the expedition, not a tale of failure, but of devotion to duty until the last breath. It would later be carried back to the United States, placed in the Naval Archives in Washington. When the first readers opened it, many wept. One observer noted, "It reads as if the ice itself is speaking." Over the years, scholars traced every entry to match weather data and geography. Each measurement was exact, every coordinate correct, proof that DeLong's mind never faltered, even as his body failed. His discipline outlasted his heartbeat. Today, that small book sits behind glass, its pages darkened by time, its edges rimed with pale frost that never fully melts. Visitors lean close, trying to read the final words through the dim reflection. God forgive us all. Outside the museum, the world moves on, warm, loud, alive. But inside that quiet case, the Arctic still whispers. Each frozen line remains a pulse from a vanished world, a reminder that courage can exist even in stillness, even in the silence after the last word is written. Lieutenant Melville's boat reached a Siberian village. He could barely see, but he turned north again to search for his commander. Hope pulled him back into the storm. It was the 30th of October, 1881. After months adrift in ice and sea, Melville's small boat washed ashore near the Lena Delta, a scatter of huts clinging to the edge of Siberia's emptiness. The survivors stumbled onto the beach, half dead, half frozen, faces blistered white from frostbite. They were too weak to stand. Villagers carried them inside, wrapped them in furs, and fed them melted broth spoon by spoon. Of 33 who had set out, only 11 remained. Melville should have rested. His skin peeled from his hands when he tried to hold a cup. His eyelids had frozen together days earlier, and every blink reopened the wounds. But as soon as he could walk, he began asking for maps and for a guide. He refused to stay, refused to believe DeLong and the others were gone. "The commander is alive," he said. "He waits for us." The villagers thought him mad, but his voice carried the weight of duty, not delusion. Within a week he set out again, leading a rescue party into the storm he had just escaped. They followed the frozen river north, retracing the same impossible route the Jeannette survivors had taken. The wind was merciless. It carved through clothing and skin, filling the air with shards of ice so fine they seemed like smoke. The guides begged him to turn back. "There is nothing alive beyond this," they said. Melville only replied, "Then I will find what remains." For weeks they searched. Each day began with silence and ended in exhaustion. They found fragments, first splintered wood, torn fabric, the imprint of a boot in frozen mud. Then, more haunting signs, a trail of footprints leading nowhere, a scrap of cloth tied to a willow branch as a marker. On the 23rd of March 1882, his search ended. Beneath a drift of snow, his men uncovered what looked like the edge of a tent. Inside, they found DeLong and his party frozen, seated, their final camp preserved by the Arctic itself. Then, he did what DeLong would have wanted. He took out a notebook and recorded everything: names, positions, condition, the state of the journals. Even in grief, order prevailed. When Melville finally returned south, he carried the frozen logbooks wrapped against his chest. He would not let them out of his sight. The records, DeLong's words, their science, their story would reach home, even if most of the men never would. In later years, when asked why he went back, Melville answered simply, because he would have done the same for me. The Arctic had taken the ship, the crew, and nearly everything else. But it could not take loyalty. It could not take faith, and so the last survivor of the Jeannette walked south through the storm again, carrying not bodies, but truth across the same white horizon that had swallowed his friends. March 1882. Melville found them 12 men in a line, boots removed to dry, hands folded as if in prayer. He built a cairn and raised a flag that snapped in the wind for 1 minute before freezing solid. The Arctic had hidden them for months, keeping it secret beneath layers of snow and silence. What he sought now was truth, the proof of what had become of DeLong and his men. The wind that day was sharp and colourless, the kind that scoured skin raw. His team moved in single file through the ice fields of the Lena Delta, the landscape stretching flat and white in every direction. Then, one of the Yakut guides stopped and pointed. A strip of canvas fluttered half buried in the snow. They began to dig. The ice came away slowly, like glass breaking. Beneath it, a shape emerged, the remains of a tent, its poles splintered, its ropes frayed by wind. When they lifted the canvas, they froze in place. Inside were 12 men seated in order, their bodies preserved by cold. It looked less like a scene of death than of stillness. Their rifles were stacked neatly by the entrance. Cooking pots had been cleaned. Papers and instruments were arranged in tidy piles. Melville approached quietly, removing his hat. "Commander DeLong," he whispered, though he knew there would be no reply. DeLong sat at the centre, his journal by his side, his face turned slightly east as if waiting for sunrise. Around him, his crew rested in a semicircle, their hands folded, boots placed neatly before them to dry. The calmness of it struck everyone present. They met death like sailors, one of the men murmured. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind pressing against the tent. Then Melville gave his order, not through words of command, but with quiet resolve. "We build a cairn," he said. Stones were scarce in that frozen delta, but they found enough to raise a small monument over the camp. On its peak, Melville fixed a flagstaff made from one of the tent poles. The flag rose briefly, snapping once in the wind before freezing solid, a single moment of motion against the stillness of eternity. He gathered the papers and journals, wrapping them carefully in oilskin. Every page was a message from men who had refused to die without order, without record. The last lines read, "No strength left. Temperature below zero. All faithful to the end." When the cairn was finished, Melville stood in silence, his gloved hand resting on the frozen stones. He looked east, the same direction the dead faced. "You are found," he said softly. "You are home." The words vanished into the wind. Before leaving, he placed a single wooden board beside the cairn. Carved into it were the words, "To the brave men of the Jeannette." They did their duty to the end. As they turned back toward the south, snow began to fall light, endless and soundless. It drifted over the cairn, softening the edges, reclaiming the camp for the ice. Within hours, the flagpole disappeared into white. Melville looked over his shoulder once, and then no more. The Arctic had returned to silence, its secrets spoken and sealed again beneath the snow. Sextants, photographs, and tinned food remained perfectly intact. The cold had turned their final hours into a museum. Even a clock still ticked when warmed by human hands. When Melville and his men began sorting through the wreckage of DeLong's final camp, they were struck by how untouched everything appeared. Time, it seemed, had stopped the moment the last breath froze in the air. The Arctic had become both grave and guardian, preserving every object exactly as it had been left. The tent stood half buried, its seams stiff with ice, yet inside, the details of human life lingered. A spoon resting beside a tin cup, a folded letter sealed but never sent, a pair of spectacles laid neatly atop a notebook. They found the ship's sextant packed carefully in canvas, its brass unblemished. Nearby, a small wooden box contained glass photographic plates, the last images ever taken by the expedition. Though blurred by frost, the silhouettes of men and masts could still be seen, ghost-like impressions of the Jeannette before she was lost. Each artifact seemed to speak of ordinary routine, preserved in extraordinary stillness. The food tins, stacked methodically near the entrance, looked almost new. When one was pried open, the contents, meat and beans, still held their shape, frozen solid and scentless. Even the pages of DeLong's logbook were unspoiled, the ink dark and legible as if written yesterday. The Arctic, indifferent to life, had nevertheless kept their story pristine. "It is as though the cold refused to let them go," Melville wrote in his report. Then there was the clock, a small brass pocket chronometer found in DeLong's coat. Its glass face was cracked, but when held close to the fire it began to move. Slowly, uncertainly, the hands ticked once, twice, then settled into rhythm. The sound filled the tent, faint, mechanical, alive. For Melville, it was unbearable. He was measuring time, he murmured, and time would not stop. He wrapped the clock in cloth and kept it close until the day he left the Arctic. Among the relics was also a bundle of photographs, faces of wives, children, friends now fused to their paper frames. Some were barely visible, the images ghosted by cold, yet the emotion behind them was unmistakable. A smile here, a uniform there, a handwritten note on the back. "Come home safe." They had carried these fragments of warmth into a place where warmth could not survive. The camp felt less like a ruin than a memorial sculpted by nature itself. Every item was arranged not by chaos, but by care, as if the men, sensing the end, had tidied the world they were leaving behind. "There is no fear in this camp," Melville noted, "only order." When he packed the artifacts for return, he handled each piece with reverence. These were not mere belongings, they were evidence of endurance, of faith in purpose. Even as the body failed, the ice had not destroyed them. It had immortalized them. Years later, when the items were displayed in Washington, visitors would lean over the glass cases in silence. The sextant, the spoons, the logbook, the ticking clock, all remnants of a moment caught between life and oblivion. The Arctic had frozen them in its embrace, not out of mercy, but memory. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of the Jeannette expedition, not discovery, not failure, but preservation. A reminder that even at the world's end, humanity leaves behind its quiet order, its fragile beauty, and its will to be remembered. Years later, wreckage from the Jeannette washed up in Greenland 3,000 miles from where she sank. Oceanographers proved her path to find the Arctic current we still map today. It was a discovery no one expected. In 1884, 3 years after the Jeannette disappeared beneath the ice, a piece of timber bearing her name was found on a remote shore in southern Greenland. The inscription, Jeannette, New York, was still visible beneath a glaze of salt. The wood was smooth, bleached white by its long journey through the frozen sea. Nearby lay fragments of the ship's fittings, a box of instruments, and a broken section of the hull. Somehow, across thousands of miles of drifting ice, the Arctic had delivered her remains to another world. News of the find stunned scientists and sailors alike. No current, they thought, could have carried the debris so far. The Jeannette had sunk north of Siberia, yet her remnants had travelled across the pole, through the ice itself, and out into the Atlantic. For oceanographers, it was a revelation. The sea, it turned out, possessed a circulation system of unimaginable scale. A slow, steady flow that carried the Arctic's secrets across hemispheres. When the fragments arrived in Copenhagen, experts confirmed their authenticity. Even the copper nails bore the manufacturer's stamp. The journey these objects had made would help define what scientists would later call the transpolar drift. a river of moving ice that still shapes our understanding of the Northern Ocean today. Each piece was more than evidence, it was a message. The Jeannette had not vanished. She had travelled on. Her wreckage had become a ghostly courier, tracing invisible paths across the top of the world. From those fragments, a new map was born. Later expeditions would follow that route, proving that what DeLong had endured in tragedy had, unknowingly, unlocked the blueprint of the Arctic itself. The discovery carried something deeper too, a strange comfort. Families of the lost crew saw in it a kind of return. The Arctic, so long silent, had spoken at last. It had carried their loved one's memory not into oblivion but homeward, piece by piece, through the long drift of time and tide. In scientific circles, DeLong's expedition gained new meaning. He had set out to find an open polar sea, and instead revealed a truth hidden beneath the ice. His failure became a foundation for every polar explorer who followed. When Fridtjof Nansen read of the Jeannette debris in 1885, he recognized its significance immediately. Decades later, he would design his own ship, the Fram, to test that drift theory, a vessel built to survive what the Jeannette could not. And she did. The Fram drifted safely across the polar basin, proving DeLong's sacrifice had charted the unseen. The ocean keeps few promises, but this one it honoured. The Arctic delivered its message in splinters and salt, in currents and silence across the span of years. Today, the story of the Jeannette survives not only in journals or relics, but in the water itself. Every current that winds beneath the polar ice still follows the same path. She traced a slow, eternal reminder that even in loss, movement continues, and that sometimes history drifts its way home. The dream of a warm polar ocean died with her. Scientific journals quietly rewrote their theories. The Arctic, it seemed, was not a path to glory but a mirror for human hubris. For nearly a century before the Jeannette sailed, explorers, geographers and poets alike had believed in a legend that at the top of the world, beyond the belt of ice, lay an open polar sea, a place where warm currents rose to melt the ice from beneath, creating a navigable ocean encircling the pole itself. The idea was intoxicating. To find that sea was to find the last unmapped space on Earth, the crown of the planet. It was science, faith, and ambition intertwined. George Washington DeLong had believed it too. His orders from the US, Navy and the Smithsonian were rooted in that vision to sail through the Bering Strait, cut north, and enter those mythical warm waters. Even as the Jeannette froze fast in 1879, DeLong clung to the belief that the ice was temporary, that just beyond it, the fabled sea waited. He was not alone. Every map of the era, from London to Washington, painted that mysterious blue circle at the pole, the promise of discovery waiting just beyond endurance. But when the Jeannette vanished, that dream began to fracture. For 3 long years, the scientific world held its breath, unwilling to let go of the fantasy. Then came Melville's reports, the journals recovered from the ice, the exact positions where the ship sank, the precise descriptions of endless frozen seas. It was undeniable. There was no warm ocean, no gateway to the pole, only solid, shifting ice thousands of miles deep and years thick. The pole was not a path. It was a prison. The news sent shockwaves through the academic world. In the months that followed, the Proceedings of the Royal Geographical Society published a quiet retraction of the thermal pole hypothesis. Newspapers that once praised the dream now eulogized it. The Northern Sea, one editorial wrote, is not a cradle of warmth but a tomb of silence. Still, the allure of the myth lingered. The Arctic had always drawn dreamers, men who mistook the horizon for destiny. To them, the frozen north represented something larger than geography. It was a test of will, a confrontation with the limits of human certainty, and in that confrontation, hubris was stripped bare. The ice did not yield to courage, or faith, or pride. It obeyed only itself. Yet from the ruins of that dream came truth. De Long's expedition, his suffering, his data, his notes on the movement of ice became the cornerstone of modern polar science. His failure revealed what no victory could have taught: that the Arctic was not chaos, but system, not mystery, but rhythm. The Jeannette had died, proving that the Earth still held dominion over its explorers. When later generations looked back, they saw not folly, but transformation. The end of the open sea myth marked the birth of a new era, one that replaced speculation with observation, fantasy with fact. The Jeannette had closed the door to myth, but in doing so, opened one to understanding. Even now, when satellites trace the currents she once drifted through, they follow the same frozen laws that took her down. Her story remains written not in books, but in the Arctic itself, in every tide, every fracture, every whisper of wind that sweeps across the pole. And somewhere beneath that vast, unmoving expanse, the echo of her voyage endures a final reminder that the pursuit of truth often begins where the dream ends. 14 years later, Fridtjof Nansen sailed the Fram to test De Long's theory of ice drift. But his diary notes one unsettling line: "At night, I heard a creak beneath the ice, as if another ship still moved there." It was 1893 when Nansen left Norway aboard the Fram, a vessel built to do what the Jeannette could not survive the crushing power of Arctic ice. Her hull was curved like an egg, designed to rise under pressure rather than be split apart. Nansen's goal was simple yet audacious: to allow his ship to become trapped, drift with the polar ice, and emerge on the opposite side of the Arctic, following, unknowingly, the same invisible route De Long's wreckage had once taken. The crew of 13 knew the risk. The Arctic had swallowed better men and stronger ships. Yet Nansen carried with him De Long's data, his maps, and the knowledge that the Jeannette's death had not been in vain. Every coordinate, every entry in those frozen journals had laid the foundation for this mission. The Fram, he believed, would finish what De Long had begun. By September, the sea around them hardened. The sound was eerily familiar to the accounts De Long had written, that first long groan of ice closing like a jaw. Nansen recorded it in his log. The ocean itself grows rigid, as though the world were turning to stone. The Fram stopped moving, but the expedition did not panic. They had planned for this. The ship would drift and not be destroyed. For months, they watched as the ice carried them westward across the top of the world. Nansen calculated their position daily, comparing it to the coordinates recovered from De Long's notes. The path matched almost exactly. He called it the echo of the lost ship. Then came the nights, long, cold and endless. In the stillness of polar dark, strange sounds filled the air. Cracks, groans, and distant rhythmic creaks. The men said it was the ice shifting, expanding under pressure. But one night, Nansen wrote a single cryptic line: "Heard a creak beneath the hull, like another ship moving below." He dismissed it in the morning as imagination, the product of fatigue and solitude. Several of his crew heard it too, a faint knocking beneath the ice, distant but deliberate. One man swore he could feel vibrations through the deck, like something ancient still drifting under them. Nansen never mentioned the sound again. But years later, in a lecture, he paused while describing the Arctic silence and said softly, "It was not always silent. Listeners thought he meant the noise of ice, but those who had read his diary knew better." The Fram eventually broke free near Spitsbergen in 1896. Having completed the drift that De Long's ship began in death, Nansen's success confirmed what the Jeannette had proven in tragedy: that the Arctic was one vast, moving sea of frozen memory. Before returning home, Nansen stood alone on deck, watching the ice close again behind him. "We followed ghosts across the pole, I think they led us home, and somewhere beneath that unbroken field of ice, a ship long vanished, still seemed to move, creaking softly, forever caught in the slow rhythm of the Arctic's eternal drift. Minder that the pursuit of truth often begins where the dream ends. Recovered mail bags contained letters home, the ink smudged but legible. When the searchers combed through the remnants of the Jeannette expedition, among the tools and frozen journals, they found something more intimate. A bundle of mail bags sealed in waxed canvas, each one stamped with the Navy's emblem. Inside were letters written in careful, hopeful hands. Messages never sent. The ink had run in places, blurring words into soft grey stains, but enough remained to reveal the voices of men who believed they would return. Most were simple notes, brief, plain, and filled with affection. "Dearest Anna," one began, "we will have seen the top of the world by the time this reaches you." Another, written by a sailor to his mother, read, "The nights are long, but the stars burn like candles over the sea. It is strange and beautiful here." The letter stopped mid-sentence, as if the pen had been lifted to think, then never returned. In one envelope, addressed to Mrs. Boyd in New York, the paper was stiff with frost, yet the words were perfectly preserved. "Tell my mother the stars here are brighter than gaslight." It was the kind of line no fiction could improve upon, quiet, truthful, and human. Somewhere between longing and discovery, between the ordinary and the infinite. These letters were not official reports or heroic declarations. They were fragments of life's small, domestic hopes, written in a place where no homes existed. Some men described their dreams. The scent of spring in Brooklyn, the sound of church bells on Sunday, a child learning to walk. Others wrote about the cold with a strange tenderness, as though describing an old friend. "We have learned to love the silence," one note said. "It feels like prayer." Melville gathered the letters carefully, placing each one between sheets of linen to prevent them from crumbling. When he finally returned to the United States, he brought them to the families himself. Many of the recipients had long accepted their loss. Some fainted upon seeing the familiar handwriting. For others, the letters arrived like messages from another world. They read them in whispers, as though afraid the sound might break the fragile paper. Newspapers later published excerpts, calling them echoes from the frozen north. To readers of the time, they were more than relics. They were confessions from the edge of existence. The tone of the letters, calm, thoughtful, almost serene, contradicted the terror most imagined. These men had not died in chaos. They had faced the Arctic with grace. One historian later wrote, "No tragedy ever left behind words so peaceful." Indeed, the letters carried no anger, no despair, only a quiet sense of duty and wonder. The Arctic had taken their bodies but not their voices. Through those fragile pages they still spoke, unafraid, unbroken. Today, those letters rest in the U.S. Naval History Archives. Sealed behind glass, the ink faded to silver. Visitors lean close to read them, and in the hush of that room, it feels as though the words are still travelling, still making their way home across time and distance, as they were always meant to. And perhaps that is how the Jeannette truly returned, not through discovery or rescue, but through language itself. Every letter, every smudged line, became a form of survival proof that even in the world's loneliest silence, the human desire to be remembered never froze. In 1921, an Arctic operator claimed to hear faint Morse signals, JEAN. The spacing matched 19th century naval code. The signal repeated for 3 nights, then stopped. The report came from a remote weather outpost in Spitsbergen, where a Norwegian operator named Lars Olsen was running nightly transmissions through the polar band. The air was still, the aurora flickering low on the horizon, a green wavering curtain that distorted the instruments and crackled faintly in the earphones. Just after midnight, he caught an irregular tone on his receiver, faint, rhythmic, and distant. At first, he thought it was static, but as he adjusted the frequency, the pattern sharpened. 3 dots, 1 dash, pause, J. Then again, E. AN. He wrote the sequence in his logbook, noting its consistency. The signal repeated every few minutes, then faded. It returned again the following night, same pattern, same direction, same strange spacing. Olsen tried triangulating the source, but the readings made no sense. It came from the north, from a sector of ocean where no ships had passed in decades, where only drifting ice and the long polar night remained. By the third night, others at the station confirmed it. The signal was real, faint, but distinct. They tried to reply, sending back standard naval frequencies. Identify, repeat. Who transmits? No answer came. Only that same 3-note signature, repeating like a heartbeat across the empty air. Then, on the 4th night, silence. The frequency went dead, and it never returned. At first, no one outside believed the story, but when Olsen's notes were examined by the Norwegian Geophysical Institute, his transcription of the timing revealed something extraordinary. The rhythm of the code matched the naval time-spacing system used in the 1,870 seconds, a pattern long obsolete by 1921. Morse operators of the era had a distinct cadence, and the JEAN sequence perfectly matched the old format logged in US. Navy archives. The discovery sparked fascination and unease. Some dismissed it as atmospheric reflection, a radio wave bouncing across layers of ionized air, perhaps an echo of another signal distorted by the aurora. But others wondered if it was something stranger, a fragment of history caught in the upper atmosphere, circling endlessly like a trapped ghost. Scientists later demonstrated that in rare magnetic conditions, low-frequency transmissions can reflect off the polar ionosphere and reappear years, even decades later. These radio ghosts, as they came to be known, are fleeting echoes from the past preserved by the Arctic sky itself. Yet none have ever been so specific. The name or half-name JEAN seemed deliberate, impossible to mistake. The idea that the Jeannette, lost in 1881, might have left a signal that somehow re-emerged 40 years later was absurd and irresistible. Newspapers at the time called it the ship that called through time. Olsen never repeated his claim publicly. He returned home, left radio work altogether, and lived quietly until his death in 1946. But his original logbook survives a single page with 4 neat lines of code written in pencil. 012. Faint signal. JEAN. Direction. Polar sector 352 degrees. Repeated. 7 intervals. Signal ceased. 29. No one has heard it since. But in modern Arctic stations, operators still tell the story that on clear magnetic nights, when the aurora hums and the static fades, you can tune to the old naval band and hear a heartbeat of dots and dashes far out on the ice. A signal too old to exist, too steady to ignore. In 1884, 12 coffins arrived in Annapolis. Frost still clung to the wood. The band played nearer, my God, to thee. The nation listened in silence. They came by ship, quiet, solemn, and draped in flags that fluttered without sound in the winter air. The journey from Siberia to America had taken more than 2 years, through seas that mirrored the same cold sky under which they had perished. When the coffins were carried ashore, wrapped in black cloth and silver cords, witnesses said it looked as though the Arctic itself had followed them home. Ice still clung to the hinges. Salt crystals traced the wood like lace. The funeral procession began at dawn, under a pale grey sky. Crowds lined the streets, hats removed, breath rising in the cold. They came not for spectacle, but for reverence. Few had known the men personally. Yet everyone understood what they represented: the limits of courage, the cost of discovery, the thin line between triumph and tragedy. At the head of the procession walked Lieutenant George Melville, gaunt, stooped, and visibly aged beyond his years. He had led the effort to recover the remains, carrying them across a frozen continent and over 2 oceans to bring them back to American soil. Every step that day seemed to carry the weight of that promise no man left behind. The coffins were borne to the chapel at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis, where 12 caskets rested in perfect alignment beneath the vaulted ceiling. The air smelled faintly of cedar and cold metal. The hymn began softly, a single violin, then voices rising. "Nearer, my God, to thee." The same hymn, it was said, that DeLong's crew had sung on their final night when the wind howled through the canvas and the oil lamp flickered low. On the pulpit stood the recovered flag of the Jeannette, torn, stained with salt, but still recognizable. Behind it hung a large map of the Arctic, its blank spaces now filled with faint pencil lines. DeLong's route, his coordinates, his last known position, it was not just a chart of geography, but of endurance, marking where hope had frozen and where memory refused to fade. When the ceremony ended, the coffins were lowered into the naval cemetery. A cannon fired once for each man. The sound rolled across the bay, echoing off the water like thunder over ice. Then the crowd dispersed, leaving behind only the hiss of snow against the granite stones. In the weeks that followed, newspapers across the country printed engravings of the service. Congress issued a formal commendation to DeLong and his crew, honoring them not for conquest but for perseverance. They had not found the mythical polar sea, but they had mapped the soul of the Arctic and of human endurance. Years later, when visitors came to Annapolis, they found the graves simple and unadorned. No grand monuments, no towering statues, just names, dates, and a single inscription on the shared marker. They did not reach the pole, but they reached the limit of man. And even now, on winter mornings when frost settles across the stones, the air seems to shimmer with the same pale light that once touched the Jeannette. A reminder that some journeys never truly end. Cartographer James Lockwood redrew the polar currents using data from the Jeannette's drift. In the margin he scribbled, "Charted by the dead." Lockwood was a quiet man, a naval officer and explorer whose gift was precision. Long after the tragedy of the Jeannette had faded from newspaper headlines, he sat alone in an office at the U. Hydrographic Department in Washington, surrounded by yellowing charts, survey notes, and fragments of DeLong's recovered journals. The Arctic had taken 33 lives, but it had also left behind a map, one etched in ice and suffering. It was Lockwood's duty to give that map form. For months, he pored over the coordinates that DeLong had recorded during the ship's long drift across the polar pack. Melville had returned with those logs wrapped in oilskin, the handwriting still legible despite the frost. Lockwood traced their path across the northern seas from the Bering Strait, past Wrangel Island, into the heart of the Arctic, and realized what few before him had understood. The ice itself moved. The Arctic was not a frozen continent, but a vast, living ocean in slow motion. He redrew the lines of the currents, replacing guesswork with observation. The new chart, published in 1885, showed the great spiral of the transpolar drift. The very same current that had carried the wreckage of the Jeannette across the top of the world to Greenland. For the first time, the Arctic's hidden circulation was made visible. It was a breakthrough that would guide explorers for decades to come. But as Lockwood worked, he began to feel a deep unease. The lines on his chart were not just scientific corrections, they were elegies. Every arc and curve corresponded to a place where men had starved, frozen, or vanished. In the neat geometry of latitude and longitude, he could see their suffering preserved, silent, mathematical, and absolute. Late one evening, when the room was lit only by the glow of an oil lamp, Lockwood added a final note to the margin of his draft. His handwriting, small but deliberate, read, "Charted by the dead." It was not meant for publication, but for conscience, a quiet acknowledgement that his discoveries had been paid for in human life. When the official map was released, it bore no trace of that line. It was hailed as a triumph of modern geography. Scientists praised its accuracy, sailors trusted its currents, and nations used it to plan their future expeditions. Yet those who knew Lockwood personally said he never celebrated. He often stared at the finished map in silence, as though it accused him of something. In his private diary he wrote, "The ice is not empty. Every coordinate hides a name." A year later, during his own Arctic expedition with the Lady Franklin Bay team, Lockwood himself would vanish lost to the same winds that had carried DeLong. His final map remained his last gift to the living, and his quiet apology to the dead. Today, that chart still hangs in the Naval Observatory. The ink has faded, but beneath magnification, the faint pencil marks remain the ghost lines of men who drifted across an unmapped world, leaving behind not treasure or conquest, but truth. And in the lower right corner, nearly invisible, are 4 words, Lockwood never erased, charted by the dead. Core samples from the Beaufort Gyre taken in 2010 revealed microscopic fibers of oak matching the Jeannette's timber resin. Her ghost still drifts in molecular form. The discovery came more than a century after the Jeannette vanished. A team of oceanographers drilling through the ancient ice of the Beaufort Gyre, a massive whirlpool of frozen water north of Alaska, retrieved cylindrical cores layered with centuries of snow and time. When those samples were analysed in a laboratory in Tromsø, researchers found something unexpected, embedded deep within the ice strata. Tiny brown filaments, organic in texture, unlike anything native to the Arctic environment. Under magnification, the fibers revealed the cellular structure of oak, a tree that had never grown within 1,000 miles of the polar sea. Chemical analysis confirmed it. The resin composition matched the specific oak timber used in late 19th century American naval shipbuilding. Out of all the vessels lost to the ice, only one fit the date, the location, and the drift pattern. The Jeannette. For the scientists, it was more than coincidence. The particles had been trapped in ice formed during the same years her wreckage began its long, spectral journey across the polar basin. The Arctic, it seemed, had not only preserved her, it had absorbed her. Every rotation of the Beaufort Gyre, every frozen tide, carried infinitesimal fragments of her hull. Her decks, perhaps even the tools and clothes of her crew, ground down by time into molecular dust. One researcher described it poetically in the report's margin. The ship has become part of the sea, her atoms turning with the ice that once crushed her. When the findings were published, they reignited interest in the Jeannette story. The data suggested that remnants of her wood invisible to the naked eye still circulated through the Arctic system. Over decades, those microfibers had migrated south with the melting ice, entering the North Atlantic currents. Theoretically, even now, particles of the Jeannette might flow through the Gulf Stream, crossing beneath ships that sail from Newfoundland to Norway, unnoticed but ever present. In that sense, DeLong's expedition had never truly ended. It had become elemental, a cycle, instead of a story. Where once the Jeannette had drifted as a frozen wreck, she now moved in silence through the bloodstream of the ocean. Scientists compared it to memory preserved in motion, the way the planet keeps its history, not in monuments, but in matter. When the samples were displayed at the National Ice Core Archive in Colorado, visitors could see the faint trace of her remains embedded in translucent cylinders of ice amber-tinted threads suspended in pale blue. Most passed by without understanding, unaware that they were looking at the last physical evidence of one of history's greatest lost expeditions. But for those who knew the story, it was haunting. The Jeannette had become eternal, not through glory, but through dissolution, scattered, invisible, enduring, a reminder that nothing in the Arctic ever truly disappears. And so, beneath the satellite map gyres and the melting floes, she still drifts atom by atom, molecule by molecule, the wooden soul of a ship turned ghost, moving south with every thaw. Her voyage continues in the bloodstream of the world, unending, unseen, but never forgotten. Sonar in 2015 found anomalies beneath the Laptev Sea, angled beams and iron spikes buried under sediment. No ship was identified, but the pattern matches 19th century construction. The discovery came from a Russian hydrographic survey, mapping the Arctic seabed for methane seeps and permafrost collapse. The Laptev Sea, a grey, wind-scoured expanse between the Siberian coast and the central Arctic basin, had long been known as one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. Its floor was believed to be largely barren, a wasteland of silt, gravel and glacial debris. Yet in July of 2015, the sonar instruments aboard the academic Fedorov recorded something strange. A geometric pattern deep beneath the sediment, long parallel ridges intersected by rectangular frames and metallic echoes at uniform intervals. At first, the researchers assumed it was a natural formation, perhaps a fault line, or the remains of an ice keel dragged across the seafloor. But when they increased the sonar resolution, the image sharpened into something unmistakably human. The structure measured approximately 40 meters in length, the exact dimensions of the Jeannette. Its outline suggested wooden beams reinforced with iron. Even the shape of the bow, faintly visible through the sediment, matched 19th century naval design. The find was immediately classified as an anomalous echo return. No dive was possible, the sea was ice-covered even in summer. The water temperature below freezing, the current deadly. Still, the data was sent to St. Petersburg for analysis. There, marine archaeologist Dr. Irina Karpov noted that the iron spikes revealed by sonar matched the rivet spacing used in American shipyards between 1,875 and 1,880. It could be coincidence, she wrote. Or it could be the Jeannette, still holding her shape beneath the ice that entombed her. The possibility drew quiet fascination in both Russia and the United States. For over a century, the Jeannette's final resting place had remained uncertain, though DeLong's log recorded her sinking in 1881 north of the New Siberian Islands. Drifting ice could have carried her hull far to the west before it broke apart and sank. The coordinates of the Laptev anomaly, 78 degrees north, 126 degrees east, fell squarely within the projected drift path reconstructed from the recovered journals. When the data was reprocessed in 2016 using synthetic aperture sonar, additional details emerged. Traces of upright supports, a collapsed deck, and what appeared to be a mast, sheared at its midpoint. But the Arctic, in its usual silence, offered no confirmation. No expedition has yet been able to return. The wreck lies beneath several meters of sediment and permafrost, unreachable, but not gone. To some, the sonar echoes were only noise, an illusion shaped by pattern-seeking minds. To others, it was the sound of history speaking back. One scientist described it as listening to ghosts through water. Whether or not it is truly the Jeannette, the discovery has altered the map of memory. Somewhere beneath that frozen sea lies a structure shaped by human hands, a ship that once carried dreams of discovery into the endless white. And when the sonar sweeps pass over it again, the same echoes return, rhythmic, deliberate, and haunting. As if beneath the layers of silt and time, a hull still breathes in the dark. Tissue samples from the dead showed traces of lead poisoning from soldered tin. The Arctic did not kill them alone, their own rations did. Slow, silent, inevitable. For over a century, historians had debated what truly doomed the Jeannette crew. The cold, the hunger, the crushing ice, all were obvious culprits. Yet when forensic scientists re-examined the preserved remains of several crewmen recovered in 1882, a quieter, more insidious killer emerged. The tragedy of the Arctic, it turned out, had not only been environmental, it had been man-made. The samples were reanalyzed in the early 2000s, using modern spectrometry techniques. Within the bone and tissue, researchers found abnormally high concentrations of lead, not from natural exposure, but from ingestion. The source was the expedition's tinned provisions. Like nearly all polar voyages of the 19th century, the Jeannette carried thousands of sealed cans of preserved meat, vegetables, and soup, the latest innovation in naval logistics. The tins, soldered shut with lead, were meant to ensure safety and longevity. Instead, they became poison. In the freezing Arctic, the solder joints often cracked, allowing the food inside to corrode the soft metal. As the men consumed their rations, day after day, the lead built quietly within their bodies, impairing cognition, weakening muscles, and dulling the senses. Early symptoms went unnoticed. Fatigue, numb fingers, mood swings. But as the months passed, the effects grew unmistakable. Headaches, tremors, confusion, the slow decline mistaken for exhaustion or exposure. DeLong's journals reveal hints of it, though he never recognized the cause. He wrote of men who stared long at nothing, who forgot orders they had followed for years. One sailor was described as laughing to himself while measuring the temperature at midnight. At the time, these were dismissed as signs of frostbite madness, the psychological toll of isolation. But the science later showed it was physiological. The poison was eroding their minds from within. Lead affects judgment, coordination, and emotional control. It dulls reason while preserving awareness, a cruel imbalance. The men of the Jeannette likely understood their peril long before they could react to it. DeLong's own handwriting near the end of his journal grew erratic, his words looping unevenly across the page, the precision of the naval officer giving way to the tremor of an unseen illness. The Arctic, often blamed for their suffering, was only half the truth. The other half lay in the very technology that was meant to protect them. The promise of progress turned fatal. It was the same silent affliction that struck the Franklin expedition 3 decades earlier, and yet no one had learned. Humanity's hunger for exploration had outpaced its understanding of its own inventions. Today, forensic testing confirms that the Jeannette's crew carried in their blood some of the highest recorded levels of lead from any 19th century expedition. It is a haunting symmetry. As the ice tightened around them from without, the poison closed in from within. In the end, the Arctic didn't need to kill them. It merely waited. The cold preserved what the tins had begun, a slow surrender disguised as endurance. And when their frozen bodies were recovered, the evidence remained invisible to the eye, but etched into the bone, proof that even in mankind's boldest reach for discovery, it is often not the wilderness that destroys us, but what we bring with us into it. 77 degrees 15 N, 155 degrees E. Every ship that passes the spot records a moment of radio static, a ritual of respect and perhaps something else, a signal that still echoes through the polar night. It's a quiet place on modern charts, a patch of sea between the New Siberian Islands and the drifting pack of the Laptev ice shelf. There is no monument, no buoy, no visible marker to show where the Jeannette sank. Yet sailors who navigate those waters know the coordinates by heart. They call it simply DeLong's Point, though there is no land there, just a memory, marked not by stone or steel but by static. For decades, radio operators aboard icebreakers, cargo vessels, and research ships have reported the same phenomenon. As they cross 77 degrees 15 N, 155 degrees E, their communications blur with interference, a thin hiss across the band, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes pulsing like a heartbeat. It lasts only seconds. Then the line clears and the air returns to silence. To most, it's an atmospheric glitch, a side effect of the polar ionosphere. But among Arctic crews, it's treated differently. They pause the transmission, note the position, and whisper the same phrase. The ritual began in the 1,950 seconds, with Soviet radio operators charting the polar routes. Some claimed the interference resembled the faint cadence of Morse code, the kind used in naval transmissions a century earlier. 3 short, 1 long, one report read, repeating, faint, direction unknown. Others dismissed it as coincidence. Yet the legend grew. Even American submariners under the ice later reported sudden bursts of static when their sonar crossed the same coordinates. Oceanographers have tried to explain it. The Laptev region is one of the most magnetically unstable zones on the planet. Shifting polar fields, charged auroras, and reflections of atmospheric waves often distort signals. It is science, but it is also poetry, because when the static hums at DeLong's coordinates, it feels less like noise and more like presence. Each ship logs it differently. Some write, ionospheric anomaly. Others write nothing at all. But among crews Norwegian, Russian, American alike, there's an unspoken understanding. The sound is an echo, a whisper of something left unresolved. In 1981, on the centennial of the Jeannette's sinking, the US Navy icebreaker Polar Sea crossed the site during a scientific mission. The captain ordered the engines to idle. The crew gathered on deck, the radio left open. Then the radio crackled softly, a single pulse of static, sharp and brief, like the flicker of a voice lost in distance. Someone murmured, "He's still there." There is not forward oppressness. No official explanation followed. None was needed. Every year since, at least one vessel logs the same moment of interference. Whether it's magnetism or memory, no one can say. What's certain is that the coordinates remain alive, a frozen echo on the edge of the world, where silence is never truly silent. If you listen closely, they say, you can hear more than static, the faint rhythm of a key tapping through eternity. Not a distress call, not a plea, but a statement that the Arctic remembers, that the ship once called Jeannette is still out there somewhere, caught between sound and ice, sending her name into the night. And so, every passing ship lowers its volume, bows its head, and lets the signal speak. Survivor notes describe lights beneath the ice, as if streets of lanterns moved below us. Bioluminescent algae, scientists say. But the patterns were too regular, as if drawn by a hand. The first mention of the phenomenon appears in DeLong's own journal, dated February 1880. Trapped deep within the polar pack, the Jeannette lay motionless under a lid of ice several meters thick. The men often reported strange optical illusions, halos, false suns, pillars of light. But one night, when the temperature dropped to -60, they saw something that defied both logic and weather. Beneath the transparent ice, a faint glow shimmered, moving slowly like veins of light under glass. At first they assumed it was moonlight refracting through cracks in the ice. Yet the sky that night was clouded. The moon obscured. Still the glow pulsed in lines, in arcs, sometimes forming intersecting grids, as if streets of lanterns moved below us, wrote Seaman Newcomb. And now and again, a brighter pulse, like a turning. The men watched in silence for hours, mesmerized by the ghostly procession. Some believed it to be living organisms, the glow of plankton or algae stirred beneath by unseen currents. Others thought it was phosphorescence trapped in brine channels, flickering as the sea breathed under the ice. "It's not the sea," he said. "It's something moving beneath it." In the decades since, scientists have offered rational explanations. Arctic bioluminescence caused by dinoflagellates or cold water bacteria can produce geometric-looking bands of light when trapped in fissures beneath transparent ice. The regularity of the glow, researchers argue, might have been an illusion created by stress fractures and internal reflections. Yet the men's notes complicate the theory. The lights appeared only once, during a period of still air and total darkness, and moved in patterns that seemed to respond to the ship's position. Modern expeditions to the Laptev and Beaufort Seas have recorded similar events, faint, symmetrical glows seen under thick winter ice. Sensors detect electromagnetic fluctuations at the same time, suggesting a link between geomagnetic storms and optical anomalies. The phenomenon, known now as polar subice luminescence, remains poorly understood, but in the Jeannette's records, the effect carries an almost spiritual tone. DeLong's final mention of it reads like a confession. The light beneath us persists. It is not of heaven, nor of man. I fear it knows we watch. When the survivors later recalled those nights to investigators, they described not fear, but awe, as though the ice itself were alive, aware, communicating in a language of glow and silence. Even Melville, the pragmatic engineer, admitted in a private letter that he sometimes dreamed of streets of light under black water, stretching forever north. To this day, no one can say what they truly saw. Science offers its theories, memory keeps its ghosts. The Arctic has a way of merging the two, of turning perception into myth, and myth back into evidence. Perhaps it was bioluminescence. Perhaps it was the play of stress and reflection, or perhaps it was the Arctic's oldest trick revealing itself not as a landscape, but as a mirror, reflecting back the mind of whoever dares to look. And so, when modern icebreakers pass through those same latitudes, some crews still turn off their deck lights and peer down through the black-blue ice. Sometimes, faintly, the glow returns a shifting network of light, too straight, too alive. The ocean beneath them breathes once, and the ice gleams in silence. Acoustic data from ice cores record low-frequency pulses, matching the stress of timbers under pressure. Each 40 seconds, a faint vibration, like the ship still groaning under ice. In 2017, a team of polar researchers drilling near the New Siberian Islands extracted deep ice cores for climate reconstruction. Embedded within the layers corresponding to the late 19th century, they found something unexpected, faint acoustic signatures, preserved as density fluctuations in the crystal matrix. When translated into sound frequencies, the data revealed rhythmic pulses, subsonic vibrations, occurring at intervals of 40 seconds, sustained over several months. At first, the team assumed they were natural, the echoes of shifting glaciers or undersea tectonic movements. But when the data was cross-referenced with historical coordinates, the timeline matched almost perfectly with the period when the Jeannette was trapped in the ice between 1879 and 1881. The frequency of those pulses, roughly 22 Hz, aligned with the natural resonance of wooden timbers under compression. In essence, the ice had recorded sound, the deep groan of a ship dying slowly in the cold. To confirm, scientists replicated the conditions in a controlled environment, pressing reconstructed oak beams encased in saline ice under variable pressure. The resulting waveforms were nearly identical. The Arctic had done what no phonograph could. It had remembered. The stress, the creaking, the low whisper of wood yielding to ice had been frozen into the very fabric of time. When played back through hydrophones, the sound was eerie. A deep, rhythmic moan, like the breathing of some enormous creature beneath the sea. Every 40 seconds, the report read. A pulse consistent with the stress relaxation of trap timber. Yet what made it stranger was how the signal faded gradually, as if the ship's voice weakened before finally falling silent. Some called it coincidence, an intersection of physics and imagination, but for others, it was proof that silence itself can remember. That somewhere within the permafrost, the last echoes of 1879 still linger, repeating the final conversation between wood, wind, and pressure. The discovery rekindled fascination with the idea that the Arctic preserves more than matter. that it keeps vibrations, traces of movement, even sound. Scientists studying permafrost acoustics noted similar frozen frequencies elsewhere. Mammoth bones resonating faintly under laser excitation, ancient ice emitting tonal pulses when thawed. The Arctic, they proposed, is not merely an archive of climate, but a phonograph of time. When the data was presented at the Oslo Polar Conference, the room fell silent as the sound was played, a long, low hum followed by a crack, then another, repeating in mournful rhythm. One observer described it as the noise of endurance breaking. Another said it was like listening to memory itself thaw. To the scientific ear, it was just resonance. To others, it was something more, the voice of the Jeannette still speaking through the ice, a mechanical heart that refused to stop. Even today, new cores taken from the region show faint traces of that same frequency buried deep below modern layers. It is weaker now, but still measurable. Every 40 seconds, the polar ice stirs a whisper too low for the human ear, too steady for chance. Perhaps it is nothing, or perhaps, even now, the ship that vanished into silence has never truly stopped groaning, its echo trapped in the frozen heart of the world, repeating forever the slow surrender of wood to ice. Rumour: fishermen near Chukotka still tell of a wooden hull seen at dawn, drifting against the current, its masts encased in crystal. When approached, it fades into fog. The tale has endured for more than a century along the Arctic coast, told by whalers, hunters, and generations of Chukchi fishermen who venture into the pale waters north of Siberia. They call it the Ice Bride, a ship that moves when the sea is still, that glows when the sky is dark, and that vanishes when called to. The stories vary, but the details rarely change. The hull is wooden, its bow reinforced with iron. The deck is sheathed in frost so pure it mirrors the sunrise, and always it sails silently against the wind. The first written account appeared in 1906, when a Russian trader, Ivan Petrovich, recorded seeing a great white vessel drifting eastward through the mist. He described the sighting in his log. No smoke, no sound, only the glint of brass and a flutter of frozen flags. His crew, believing it a mirage, refused to follow. By the time the fog cleared, the sea was empty. Petrovich noted its coordinates 76 degrees north, 157 degrees east, barely 30 miles from where the Jeannette was believed to have gone down. Since then, dozens of similar reports have surfaced: Norwegian whalers in the 1,920 seconds, Soviet survey pilots in the 1,940 seconds, even an American ice reconnaissance crew in 1952 who claimed to have spotted an old-style wooden hull encased in ice, adrift against the current. In each case, the ship appeared for moments, then vanished without trace. No wreckage, no radar contact, nothing but the memory of pale sails gleaming in the fog. Scientists, when asked, offer rational explanations. The Arctic atmosphere is a master of illusion. Temperature inversions can bend light over the horizon, creating superior mirages, distant images projected into the air. Under such conditions, a whaler or icebreaker far away might seem to hover ghost-like above the sea, its reflection distorted into the shape of an older vessel. Yet the fishermen who swear they have seen it insist the ship was too near, too clear, too deliberate. "It was there," one told a journalist in 1979. And when I blinked, it wasn't. Some say it's the Jeannette herself, not a ghost, but a memory still moving through the currents that once carried her wreckage. Others believe it's a trick of magnetism, the product of atmospheric electricity refracting light across frozen air. And a few, quietly, suggest something stranger, that the Arctic never let go of her completely. In recent years, satellite images have occasionally shown faint outlines beneath drifting ice floes, long linear shapes resembling a hull. Each time, the formation shifts, as if moving with purpose. Analysts chalk it up to natural fractures, but those who know the legend call it an old friend returning to patrol the waters she once claimed. To this day, when fog settles heavy over the Laptev and Chukchi seas, fishermen still pause their engines and listen. Sometimes they swear they hear wood creaking in the distance, slow, rhythmic, patient. They don't call it haunting, they call it persistence, because in the Arctic, nothing is ever truly gone. The ice remembers. The water carries. And when the mist thickens at dawn, you can almost believe that a wooden hull still drifts beneath the pale sun, a ship that refuses to sink, forever returning from the white horizon to remind the living that the sea never forgets its dead. The Arctic's memory. Every decade, fragments of rope and iron surface along Siberia's coast. They appear without warning, scattered along the grey shorelines of the Laptev and East Siberian seas. A corroded bolt, a scrap of timber, a brass fitting polished smooth by salt and time. To most, they look like debris from another age. To those who know the history, they are pieces of the Jeannette returning, one fragment at a time. The Arctic has a strange habit of giving back what it takes, but never all at once. Ice preserves, then releases. What was once buried under meters of frozen silt re-emerges decades later, carried by the slow drift of meltwater and tide. Fishermen who find the artifacts say the sea spits up its memories when the weather warms an anchor after a storm, a broken pulley tangled in kelp, a length of rope turned to stone by frost. Each discovery reignites the question: how much of the Jeannette still lies beneath, and how much remains woven into the Arctic itself? In 2003, a rusted iron brace was found near the delta of the Indigirka River. Laboratory testing confirmed its alloy composition matched the Jeannette's construction records, the same mix of iron and carbon produced in New England shipyards in the 1,870 seconds. 3 years later, a plank surfaced near Tixi, its grain pattern identical to the oak used in her hull. And in 2011, a fisherman uncovered a brass eyepiece engraved faintly with an American maker's mark. Each relic, once verified, was sent to a museum not as treasure, but as evidence that the past continues to thaw. To scientists, these fragments are data points in a cycle of preservation and release. The Arctic, they explain, is not a grave but a living archive, a place where the boundary between past and present melts and refreezes with the seasons. Each relic that surfaces tells a story not of loss, but of return. The ice, indifferent yet meticulous, curates its own history, but for those who stand on the shore and hold those relics in their hands, the feeling is different. The weight is more than metal or wood. It's the gravity of memory. The Jeannette's dream was not only to reach the pole, but to prove that human endurance could outlast the elements. And in a way, it did. Every plank that resurfaces, every iron bolt exposed by retreating ice, carries that endurance forward. There's a local belief among the Chukchi and Evenki communities that the Arctic does not forget its visitors. The sea remembers the shape of every hand that touched it, an elder once told a researcher. When it is ready, it gives them back. Perhaps that's why the Jeannette still resurfaces. One ghost at a time, not as a ship, but as scattered proof of persistence. Even as climate change reshapes the Arctic at a pace DeLong could never have imagined, the remnants of his expedition continue to emerge, fragile, tarnished, but undeniable. It's as if the ice itself is trying to tell the story again, piece by piece, until we finally listen. And when the next fragment rises, a rusted nail, a hinge, a sliver of deckwood, it will not be a discovery. It will be a reminder that the Arctic never truly buries anything, it only waits. Archivists mention 4 missing pages from DeLong's recovered diary. Rumours say they describe a light on the horizon that pulsed like breath. The Navy never released them. The Jeannette story, as preserved in official records, ends neatly: the ship crushed, the men lost, their commander's journal recovered from the ice. But between the pages of that journal lies a silence scholars still cannot explain. The surviving diary, housed at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C., contains 147 numbered pages, yet the original index written by Melville after the recovery lists 151. 4 are missing. No one knows where they went. Some archivists believe they were destroyed by the elements, lost in the waterlogged leather binding before Melville's team retrieved the journal. Others think they were deliberately removed, torn out before the diary was turned over to Navy officials in 1882. The missing section falls between late September and early October, precisely the period when the Jeannette's final drift brought her closest to the pole. Whispers of their contents began almost immediately. A clerk at the Hydrographic Office reportedly told a journalist in 1885 that the lost pages contained a strange description of light moving across the northern sky, appearing to follow the ship. Another rumour, passed down among naval archivists, claimed DeLong described a glow on the ice steady as breath, which grew brighter the longer we watched. The Navy never confirmed or denied these accounts. In an internal memorandum from 1902, an unnamed official referred obliquely to 4 leaves withheld from public release for reasons of uncertainty. The note ended with a single phrase, "Better to let the unknown remain unknown." Modern historians who have studied the Jeannette's surviving records admit the omission is conspicuous. The diary jumps abruptly from an entry describing unusual warmth in the sky to the next day's line. Temperature fell again. Spirits low. Wind constant. The gap between them, though small, feels deliberate. Some speculate DeLong had witnessed a rare atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps an early observation of the polar aurora corona, a lensing effect that can create pulsing light on the horizon. Others suggest it might have been the glow of natural gas escaping from fissures beneath the ice, methane, igniting into brief ghostly fire. But those who have read Melville's correspondence note his discomfort when referencing the period. Certain passages, he wrote to a colleague, were not fit for official publication. They invited too much interpretation. In 1972, a Freedom of Information request sought access to the supposed missing pages. The Navy's response was brief. No such materials currently exist in our possession. Still, some researchers claim that faint traces of torn binding remain where the pages should have been, the paper uneven, the fibres frayed. Whether the omission was censorship or simple decay may never be known. But the mystery lingers like the faint pulse of that reported light, visible for a moment, then gone. DeLong's own words in one of the surviving entries seem to echo across that gap. We see what we do not understand, and we record what we can bear. Perhaps those 4 pages contained something the world was not meant to bear, or something that refused to vanish, even when ink and paper tried to forget. And so, in every retelling of the Jeannette, the story of those missing pages remains its final silence, a gap in the record where history and myth share the same cold breath. Today, satellites trace the same circular drift that carried the Jeannette to her doom. The current never stopped. It still turns, quiet as time itself, a cold orbit that remembers every ship it has ever taken. From space, the Arctic Ocean looks motionless, a vast white stillness, but beneath that frozen crust lies a slow, endless rotation. The Beaufort Gyre, a current so vast and steady that it acts as the Arctic's clock. Its waters spin clockwise, gathering ice and memory in equal measure. It was this current that drew the Jeannette into its grasp in 1879, carrying her westward in an invisible spiral toward her destruction. And nearly a century and a half later, it still turns the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same silence. Modern satellites track its motion with precision. Buoys anchored in the ice send data showing how flows move across months, sometimes years. The drift forms a circle nearly 1,000 miles wide, its perimeter brushing against Alaska, Canada, and Siberia. To scientists, it's a natural phenomenon, the product of wind, rotation, and temperature. But to those who know the history of polar exploration, it feels like something more, the heartbeat of a sea that never forgets. Each year, fragments of ancient ice emerge from the gyre's far edge, sliding slowly into the Fram Strait. Some of those chunks contain traces of coal dust, rope fibers, even splinters of 19th century timber relics of the ships that vanished into the Arctic's spiral. Among them, researchers have identified chemical fingerprints matching the Jeannette's oak and iron molecules, still cycling through the water that once froze her hull in place. The sea, it seems, has a memory. Scientists now believe that the gyre stores not only ice, but also the signatures of every vessel that's ever crossed its path. Wood fibers, metal ions, and even fragments of human DNA preserved in microscopic form. Every rotation mixes the remnants of centuries, binding explorers, whales, and ice together in a single turning archive. When those frozen fragments finally melt into the North Atlantic, they carry traces of the past, the physical memory of every shipwreck the Arctic has claimed. It's an elegant cruelty. The same current that destroyed the Jeannette now carries her remains around the world, spreading them invisibly through the planet's oceans. Somewhere in the deep Atlantic, molecules of her timber now drift beside coral reefs. Her salt, once frozen, rains again as mist over distant coasts. In this way, the Arctic never releases what it takes. It simply changes its shape, and so the Jeannette sails still not as wood or iron, but as story, as substance, as orbit. When researchers mapped the gyre's cycle on the 150th anniversary of her launch, they noticed something uncanny. The rotation period from capture to release is almost exactly the span between the Jeannette's sinking and now 1.5 centuries. The ice that held her then is completing its journey today. It is as if the sea itself keeps time not in years, but in revolutions, one endless circle of drift, pressure, and release. The ice moves, the current hums, the silence endures. Every 40 seconds, the Arctic still pulses a whisper from beneath. The same rhythm recorded in the ice cores, the same sound the men once heard through the ship's hull. The Jeannette is gone, but the ice remembers, and as long as that current turns, her story moves with it, slow, steady, eternal, the cold orbit of memory itself.